Welcome back. Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet. Somewhere without screaming, without bruises, without even a raised voice. Because you don't need violence to destroy a human being. You just need to unmake their mind. A little silence, a little doubt, a little confusion about what's real, what's true, or who they are. This is a slow erasure. Some of the methods are psychological. Some are cultural. Some might already be happening around you, so settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin with the quietest method of all. Solitary confinement as psychological execution. They say the worst part isn't the silence, it's the sound of your own thoughts, when they stop making sense. Solitary confinement was never designed for punishment. It was invented as an experiment, a tool to make the soul visible. In the early 19th century, reformers believed that by locking a man alone in a cell with nothing but a Bible and his conscience, he would naturally repent. Alone, stripped of distraction, he would meet himself. And in meeting himself, he would change. But that didn't happen. What happened instead was something far more terrifying. The human brain is built for connection, not philosophically, biologically. Your sense of self, your perception of time, your grip on language and logic, all of it is co-regulated by other people. You're not thinking in a vacuum. You're thinking in a network of eye contact, of ambient noise, of shared schedules, of feedback. Break that network, and you don't get enlightenment. You get disintegration. Put someone in a small windowless cell. Remove conversation. Remove human touch, remove clocks, remove sunlight. Do it for 10 days. Then 30, then 90. Soon they stop sleeping. Their dreams bleed into the day. They begin hearing voices, not metaphorically. They start hallucinating figures on the walls. They forget words. They forget time. They forget why they're there. Eventually, they forget who they are. In extreme cases, they begin to dismember themselves, gnawing, cutting, swallowing pieces of cloth or plastic, not to die but just to feel real again. In a study conducted by psychiatrist Dr. Stuart Grassian, former inmates who had endured extended solitary confinement reported near-identical symptoms, panic attacks, visual distortions, hypersensitivity to light and sound, intrusive violent thoughts, and the terrifying belief that their minds were breaking apart in slow motion. One man described it as being buried alive with a time bomb in your head. Another said, "I would pace the room until the floor cracked. I lost track of the words I was thinking." This isn't poetic suffering. It's neurological collapse. When there is no one else to orient you, not even a guard you can scream at, the feedback loops inside your head start to spin out of control. Thoughts echo without end. Memories recirculate without context. The architecture of the self begins to fracture. This isn't because of torture. It's because of absence. Solitary is sometimes portrayed as the humane alternative to physical punishment. A clean room, a simple bed, food slid silently through a slot. No beatings, no shouting, no chains, just quiet. But quiet, extended long enough, is violence. Not against the body, against the structure that makes a mind possible, against continuity, context, and communion. When those go, the person goes with them. One prison psychologist put it plainly. People think solitary breaks your spirit. That's not true. It breaks your identity. The spirit's already gone. It's the your part that starts to slip away. The memory of how to be a self. In long-term solitary, prisoners start talking to bugs, not because they've gone insane, but because the need for connection is stronger than reason. If the brain can't find another human, it will invent one. If no voice responds, it will echo its own until hallucinations form. The cruelest part. Once released, many of these prisoners don't know how to be people anymore. Re-entry isn't healing. It's confusion. Crowds are unbearable. Conversations feel fake. Time seems unreal. The ability to make eye contact, to laugh at jokes, to respond with emotion, all atrophied. Like muscles unused for too long. They weren't punished. They were dismantled. This is why some call solitary confinement the clean death. No visible wounds, no scars, just a hollowing out, a person slowly vanishing while their body stays perfectly still. And when that cell door finally opens, it's not a person who walks out. It's a body-shaped absence, trying to remember what it was before the silence. Now imagine that same mechanism, applied not in a prison, but in a home, a child sent to their room in isolation for hours, for days. A partner given the silent treatment, not once, but chronically, ritualistically. Not as a punishment, but as a means of control. Denial of presence, denial of recognition. It doesn't take a prison. All it takes is absence. Just enough of it for the person to forget they're real. That was one way to erase a mind. There are 49 more, and they get worse. Sensory deprivation and the collapse of perception. There's a trick you can try if you're curious. Turn off every light. Close the door. Block the windows. No phone. No sound. No movement. Just sit. For 15 minutes. Don't check the time. Feel how quickly your brain starts to squirm. Feel how desperate you get, not for entertainment, not for excitement, just for something to orient you. A noise. A shadow. Even your own breathing magnified. Now imagine that for 5 hours, or 10, or 30. Imagine floating in a tank of warm water, body temperature, limbs suspended, no light, no noise, no smell, no sense of up or down, nothing pressing on your skin. No floor, no wall, just absence, perfect absence. Welcome to sensory deprivation. The process is deceptively gentle. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't scream. It doesn't restrain. It simply removes, input by input, until nothing is left but your raw, unfiltered mind and the endless void it was never meant to face alone. The U.S. military tested this in the 1950s. Volunteers, mostly students, were paid to lie in total isolation for extended periods. Eyes covered, ears blocked, gloves on. They lasted less than 3 days before symptoms began. Hallucinations, disorientation, time distortion, panic, auditory breakdowns. Some reported hearing choirs, others saw strange lights. One claimed to speak to God, one just wept. None of them were tortured, none were touched. All they did was float. You might think, that sounds like a spa treatment. But spa tanks last 60 minutes. You're not being interrogated. You're not uncertain whether anyone will come back. You have a towel and a timer. Now remove the timer. Remove the control. Remove the promise of escape. Sensory deprivation, extended long enough, becomes psychological execution. The mind begins inventing data to replace what it's lost. You begin to see things, not because you're dreaming, but because your brain has to. Vision doesn't shut off, it just fills in noise. Your auditory cortex, still listening, so it plays tapes from your past. Memories, fears, voices. This isn't madness. This is the brain doing its job. In the absence of reality, it manufactures one. There's a phrase psychologists use: the mind abhors a vacuum. It will choose terror over emptiness, pain over nothing, meaning over silence. Let's come back to you for a second. Have you ever been stuck in a waiting room with no phone? Or in a room where the power went out, and it was pitch black? That itch behind your eyes, the creeping tension, the way your own heartbeat starts to sound too loud. That's the beginning of sensory collapse. Now stretch it to 12 hours. 24, 48. That's when the walls start breathing. That's when time melts. That's when you forget what your own voice sounds like. One CIA black site used a variation of this. Detainees were put into soundproof, pitch-black boxes for days. They weren't beaten, just sealed. One man, when released, tried to speak but forgot the word for door. Another said he didn't remember if he was still alive. The horror isn't what happens inside the box. It's what doesn't happen. No correction, no feedback, no confirmation. You begin to doubt your own body, your own past, your own thoughts. This is how reality breaks. Not with trauma, with lack. One psychologist described a patient who'd spent 72 hours in a dark, padded environment. When released, he refused to touch the floor, said it felt wrong. Spent days tapping walls, reorienting himself with texture and light, trying to remember what was real. And it doesn't have to be clinical. Parents can use this. Schools can use this. Cults use this. Just take a child, blindfold them, isolate them. Don't speak. Don't yell. Don't strike. Just vanish. After a few hours, they'll start to call for you, then beg, then apologize for things they haven't done. Then eventually, they'll just sit still, silent, reset. That's not discipline. That's induced psychosis. Now ask yourself something gently. What part of yourself still exists if you have no senses feeding into it? What do you become when all you are is thoughts, untethered from space and time? If your world has no smell, no taste, no warmth, no pain, are you still in it? Or are you a ghost haunting your own mind? This is the beauty of it. The elegance. You don't have to break anyone. Just take away the world and wait. One more method. One more human erased. Next, we take away sound, but not all of it, just yours. Let me show you how silence can scream. The hole in black sites, total social silence. You might think it's the darkness that breaks you. It's not. It's the absence of sound. More specifically, the absence of human sound. No voices, no footsteps, no doors creaking in the distance, just the ambient hum of machinery. A vent, maybe the rustle of your own clothing, and eventually, even that fades. They call it the hole. It's not a metaphor. It's a real place, buried inside certain prisons and interrogation sites, underground, no windows, no clocks, a chamber designed for one purpose, total social silence. You're not there to be hurt. You're there to be unacknowledged. And that's what breaks people. Because human beings don't just crave communication, they require it to remain functional. A glance, a sigh, a knock on the wall, these tiny signals keep your inner world connected to the outer one. Take them away, and the divide begins to grow. In black sites, detainees are often kept in solitary rooms where guards are instructed to never respond, not even to screams. You can shout for hours, beg, threaten, cry. You'll hear nothing in return, not even footsteps. The silence is surgical. Eventually, you stop shouting. Then you stop speaking. Then you stop thinking in sentences. You begin to wonder if your voice works, if you're deaf, if you're dead. Now, here's where it gets worse. Some survivors report that during their stay in the hole, they started to doubt they ever existed at all. One man, held in such conditions for 47 days, described a moment where he suddenly became convinced that he was just a brain in a jar. Not as a philosophical thought experiment, but as a visceral certainty. He said, "Verstadt. I couldn't remember what my face looked like. I thought I was a voice suspended in space. A mistake. No beatings, no noise, just nothing." There's a difference between being ignored and being erased. Ignored means someone still sees you, they just choose not to act. Erased means there's no one. No one watching, no one listening, no one to ignore you. Some detainees try to force attention by damaging themselves, banging their heads on the wall, cutting into their skin, screaming until their throats collapse. Not because they want out, because they want proof that someone else exists, that they're still in the world. Sometimes they're rewarded with a voice through a speaker, but the voice doesn't answer their questions. It reads a number or an instruction, then silence again. The voice never calls you by name, because names imply acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is dangerous. It means you're still a person. This isn't ancient. This isn't theoretical. This is how modern psychological warfare works. And the most terrifying part, You can simulate this without a prison. Just set rules. No speaking unless spoken to. No eye contact. No physical affection. No praise. No warmth. No recognition. Parents do this to children, spouses to each other, entire communities to dissidents. It's called selective social death, keeping the body, erasing the identity by refusing to engage with it. And over time, the person begins to disintegrate from the inside, not from hate, from neglect. And if you're listening to this right now, if you've ever gone days without hearing your name spoken, if you've walked into rooms and felt like a ghost, you already know what it does. Your thoughts slow down, your sense of time dissolves, and worst of all, you begin to wonder if maybe you deserve it. That's the real weapon, not the silence. The internalization of the silence. When the external absence becomes your internal voice. I must not matter, or someone would have spoken. That's the moment the mind begins to turn on itself. And once that happens, you don't need a guard. You don't need a wall. You become your own erasure. You forget what it was like to be someone people responded to. You forget you ever expected it. And once the expectation is gone, there's no one left to miss you. That was just one more method. Simple, clean, effective. Now let's go deeper. What happens when silence isn't just absence? What if it becomes the punishment itself? What if speaking is allowed, but no one is listening? Let's talk about forced silence. When your words are erased the moment they leave your mouth, because the next way to kill a mind is to let it speak into a void and let it echo there forever. Forced silence as erasure of voice. Not hear you. Maybe it wasn't clear. Still nothing. You start to second-guess your tone. Maybe you said it wrong. Maybe you were too emotional, too aggressive, too soft, too weird. Still nothing. Eventually, you stop speaking, not because you want to, but because your words feel dead before they even leave your mouth. That's not awkwardness. That's not shyness. That's a trauma response. It's called selective mutism when it becomes chronic, but you don't need a diagnosis to feel it. It happens in homes, in offices, in relationships. The slow burn of being treated like your voice is static. Like you're a screen someone muted and forgot about. Like your inner world is a closed circuit, thoughts bouncing endlessly with nowhere to land. This isn't about solitude. It's about being denied participation in reality. In black sites, they sometimes allow detainees to speak freely, but the guards are instructed never to respond. Not even eye contact. Not even acknowledgement that a sound was made. Speak all you want. Big egg. Cry, confess, the silence remains. And that silence isn't absence, it's rejection. There's a term in psychological warfare manuals, verbal nullification. It means allowing speech while systematically denying any reaction. The purpose isn't punishment. The purpose is to induce collapse, of narrative, of confidence, of self. Because if you talk and no one answers, the message becomes clear. Your voice has no weight in this world. Now think about this. Have you ever tried to speak in a group and been talked over? Have you ever shared an idea only for it to be ignored and then repeated by someone else who gets credit? Have you ever confessed something painful only to be met with silence or a subject change? That's not just rude. That's erasure. And if it happens enough, it teaches you something corrosive, that your words are a burden, that speaking is a risk, that silence is safer. Some children raised in abusive homes develop chronic hoarseness, not from yelling, from unspoken words, tension locked in the throat, emotion rerouted into the body. Their voice never developed the confidence to exist in the world. They became fluent in silence because they learned that sound was dangerous. There's also a weaponized version of this. It's called communication blackout. In cults and abusive relationships, victims are sometimes forced into silence under the pretense of harmony. Don't speak unless you have something positive to say. Don't bring the mood down. Don't be difficult. Let it go. It sounds peaceful, but it's a cage. You're being taught that only certain versions of yourself are allowed to speak. Everything else gets buried, and eventually, you stop trying to dig it back up. You bury your own anger. You police your own voice. You mute your grief before it has the chance to form into words. And here's the most disturbing part. People who've been silenced long enough start to believe they chose it. They say things like, "Oh, I just prefer to listen. I'm more of an observer. I'm not great at expressing myself." But underneath that, you'll often find years of speech that went nowhere, words that were never received, pain that was met with a shrug, stories that faded into the air like breath on a cold window. It doesn't take a prison cell to do this. It doesn't take torture. It just takes enough unanswered words, enough one-sided conversations, enough careful, calculated nothing, and the person who once tried to speak stops trying, not because they're healed, because they're trained, because they've learned that speaking is a performance that no one watches, because they now believe, deep down, that their voice is just noise, and eventually they forget it was ever more than that. That's the moment the internal silence becomes permanent. Even in a crowd, even with friends, even when asked directly, they hesitate, they second-guess, they water down, they say nothing. Because long ago, someone taught them that their voice was expendable. That's how you kill a person's voice without ever telling them to shut up. Just don't listen. Let them say everything, and give them nothing in return. Eventually, they'll do the rest themselves. But what if silence wasn't enough? What if you want to go deeper, to not just silence a voice, but delete the connection? To make someone feel like they're the only mind left in existence? Let's take it further. Imagine exile without movement. Imagine banishment without borders. Let's talk about what happens when a human is socially erased, not punished, not beaten, just left out of the world. Forever. Let me show you what it feels like to disappear. While your body keeps breathing, the invisible cage, social ostracism, and exile. You don't need walls to build a prison. You just need everyone else to look away, not in anger, not with cruelty, just as if you aren't there. Social ostracism is one of the oldest tools of psychological destruction in human history. Long before solitary cells, before padded rooms, before psychological diagnoses, there was banishment, exile, erasure by omission. No physical pain, just the quiet horror of being unwelcome everywhere. Let me show you how this works. In ancient Athens, they had a ritual called ostracismos. Once a year, citizens could vote to exile someone from the city, not for a crime, not for treason, just because they were seen as dangerous, too influential, too unpredictable, too strange. If enough people scratched your name into a piece of pottery, you were cast out for 10 years. No trial, no defense, no appeal. You didn't die. You just stopped belonging. And that was often worse, because we aren't wired to live in isolation. We aren't just social creatures, we're social constructions. Without reflection from others, the self starts to fray. Exile removes that mirror. And when the mirror goes, the image disappears too. Now imagine something more modern. A girl in middle school, suddenly iced out by her entire friend group. No one tells her why. They just stop replying. She walks into class. No one looks up. She posts something online. No one responds. She sits alone at lunch, and they giggle just out of earshot. It's not bullying. It's silence, and it's devastating. Psychologists call this social exclusion, and the effects are measurable. Increased cortisol, declines in immune function, memory impairment, even changes in body temperature regulation. One study found that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. Your mind doesn't separate emotional erasure from being stabbed. But this isn't just anecdotal. It's systemic. Entire castes in India were labeled untouchable. Not just forbidden from temples or schools, socially erased, people would cross the street to avoid looking at them. Their names weren't recorded. Their existence was treated like a contamination. In Imperial Japan, the Burakumin were similarly shunned. Their ancestors had worked in impure professions like butchery or leatherwork. And so, generation after generation, they were denied homes, jobs, even marriages, not by law, but by unspoken agreement. They could speak, but no one would hear. You don't need to kill someone to destroy them. You just need to remove the social scaffolding they stand on. Every culture has its own variation. In Amish communities, it's called midung, total shunning. In cults, it's called disconnection. In high school, it's just ghosting. The result is the same, a person who still exists, but has nowhere left to be. Even in modern prisons, ostracism is weaponized. Inmates labeled as snitches or child offenders are not just attacked, they're exiled inside the social ecosystem. No one speaks to them. They're left to rot, not physically, but mentally, as their status dissolves into nothing. Now let me show you something darker. During the Cultural Revolution in China, entire families were socially disappeared, not executed, not imprisoned, just denounced. Their neighbors stopped acknowledging them. Their coworkers pretended not to know them. Children would come home to find their school records erased. Their family name became a curse. Over time, they became unpersoned, alive but irrelevant. Their crime, thinking the wrong thoughts, or being related to someone who did. And once you're declared unworthy of attention, the mind begins to follow. Because there's something we don't like to admit. Most of our identity is built through feedback. You say something, someone laughs. Now you're funny. You help someone. They thank you. Now you're kind. You argue. Someone pushes back. Now you're strong. Take that loop away. No response, no pushback, no reflection, and you stop developing. Eventually, you stop existing to yourself. You might be listening to this and thinking, no one's ever exiled me. But exile doesn't always look like banishment. Sometimes it's being in a group chat where no one responds. Sometimes it's watching everyone else get invited and not you. Sometimes it's walking into a room and feeling not hated but irrelevant. And when that happens over and over, you start to shrink. You speak less, you volunteer less, you share less of yourself until eventually there's not much left to share. You don't even remember what it felt like to be included. You become cautious, quiet, ghost-like. You train yourself not to interrupt, not to impose, not to exist too loudly. And the worst part, you call it being low maintenance. You take pride in it. But it's not pride. It's adaptation. It's survival. Because somewhere deep down, your mind made a calculation. If I can't belong, at least I can disappear on purpose. That's the invisible cage. No bars, no chains. Just the slow, silent surrender of a person who realized no one's looking for them. Not because they're bad, because they've been edited out of the script. That was exile. One more method, one more mind. Slowly, gone. Now let's take this erasure all the way to the beginning. Not adulthood. Not community. Let's go back to infancy and ask, what happens when a newborn cries and no one comes? Because sometimes the first erasure is the most complete. No touch, no eye contact. Infant neglect as mind deprivation. You don't remember it, but your mind was born through other people's faces. Before you had language, before you understood object permanence or time or your own name, there was touch. There were eyes. There were smiles and coos and voices that rose and fell in rhythm with your cries. That wasn't just affection. That was instruction. That's how a brain becomes a mind. But what happens if it doesn't? Let me tell you about a room. A silent one. Rows of cribs. Clean. Organized, the babies fed on schedule, diapers changed. No physical abuse, no visible harm, Just one thing missing. Touch. No cuddling, no rocking, no cuddling, no names spoken, no eye contact. These were orphanages in 20th century Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu's regime. The state had criminalized birth control and mandated childbirth to grow the population. The result was a wave of unwanted children, institutionalized in massive, underfunded facilities. Thousands of infants, very few caregivers, no affection, no time. To outside observers, it looked efficient. The babies were quiet. But that was the first red flag. Healthy babies cry. They cry because they expect someone will come. A hungry cry, a lonely cry, a scared cry, each one a signal fired into the void. And when no one responds, eventually the baby stops. Not because they're content, because they've learned there's no point. What happened in those Romanian orphanages wasn't murder. It wasn't even overt neglect. The children were clothed, fed, and kept alive. But as psychologists and aid workers later discovered, something far worse had happened. They hadn't developed minds. MRI scans years later showed reduced brain volume, especially in areas tied to emotion, memory, and social interaction. Many had attachment disorders. Some never learned to speak. Others developed conditions resembling autism, but with a cause rooted not in genetics, but in deprivation. This isn't rare. In the 1940s, psychoanalyst René Spitz studied infants raised in sterile hospital environments, what we now call failure to thrive conditions. They received physical care but no affection. Within months, these infants became withdrawn, unresponsive, and developmentally delayed. By 1 year, many of them had regressed. By 2 years, some died. Of what? Not disease. Not starvation. Of absence. Now I want you to think about what that means. That a human being, with all the raw materials for thought, language, memory, emotion, can fail to activate those circuits if no one mirrors them back. You need to be seen to learn how to see yourself. This isn't sentimental. It's biological. When a parent smiles at a baby and the baby smiles back, it's not just cute, it's synchronization. A loop of mutual regulation, heartbeat, breathing, emotion. These micro-interactions sculpt the nervous system. Without them, the blueprint goes unbuilt. The infant doesn't learn how to regulate distress, doesn't learn to differentiate self from world, doesn't learn that they exist as someone others respond to, and the damage doesn't stop at infancy. Children raised in environments of chronic emotional neglect often develop what's called developmental trauma. It's not the trauma of one violent event. It's the slow erosion of selfhood caused by never being fully mirrored. They grow up hyper-vigilant, scanning for threat or approval. They either crave attention or avoid it completely. They can become brilliant performers, people-pleasers, caretakers, doing anything to receive the feedback that was missing early on. Or they go the other way, dissociating, numbing out, living behind glass. And here's where it turns inside out. They may become parents themselves, but without a model for being seen. They struggle to see their own child, and so the absence continues. Not from cruelty, from transmission, from a lineage of minds left half-formed, because somewhere along the line, someone cried and no one came. Now ask yourself something real. When did you first feel seen? Do you remember a face, a moment? Or has your whole life felt like a performance in a room with no audience? Because the roots of that feeling might go deeper than memory. They might go all the way back to touch that didn't happen, to eyes that never met yours, to a voice that never said your name like it meant something. And here's the horror. Once you grow up, no one checks. No one asks how much of you never got built. You can go your whole life missing entire emotional organs, and the world will just assume you're cold, distant, strange, because it's not illegal to forget a baby's soul, only their body. But the soul is where the person lives. And if it never finishes forming, there may be nothing left to erase later, because they were never really there to begin with. That was erasure before language. the first silence. But now let's flip it. Let's imagine the opposite scenario. What happens when a person is surrounded by people, but denied the right to be alone with themselves? Let's talk about what happens when you're always watched, always evaluated, always expected to perform. Let me show you how constant surveillance can erase your inner life. Prisoner of your own mind, locked-in syndrome. There's a version of erasure that doesn't require silence from others. It requires silence from you, permanent, absolute, and involuntary. It's not exile. It's not isolation. It's not punishment. It's worse. It's being trapped inside your own body, conscious, aware, and helpless. Welcome to locked-in syndrome. Imagine this. You wake up in a hospital bed. You can hear the beeping of machines. You can feel the air from a vent on your face. You try to sit up, but nothing moves. Not your arms, not your legs, not your lips. You try to scream. Nothing. Your voice doesn't work. Your breathing is controlled. Your body has become a shell, and you are still in it. That's not a metaphor. It's a rare neurological condition, often caused by brainstem stroke, traumatic brain injury, or severe disease. The part of your brain responsible for thinking, remembering, feeling, that's still intact. You're fully conscious. But the motor pathways that control your body, gone. You're alive, but no one knows it. The most famous case is Jean-Dominique Bauby, the editor-in-chief of Elle magazine in France. At 43, he suffered a massive stroke that left him completely paralyzed, except for one eye. That's how he communicated. He dictated an entire book, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, letter by letter, by blinking once for yes and keeping his eyes still for no, as someone recited the alphabet to him over and over. The book took months to write. He died days after it was published. His mind had been vivid, alive, full of memories, dreams, regrets, stories, but to the world, he had been a lifeless body. Here's the terrifying part. Most patients with locked-in syndrome are initially thought to be in a coma, unresponsive, brain dead. Some are left that way for days, some for years. No one knows they're still inside. And they are thinking, remembering, observing, and screaming internally. Until someone finally notices a flicker, a blink, a trace, or no one ever does. Now think about the psychological reality of that. You're there, but nothing you say or do matters. No input, no output, no chance to prove you're real. You become a ghost trapped inside flesh. There's a deep existential horror in this. It's the nightmare version of the self. Pure consciousness, with no agency, no recognition, no escape. In a way, it's the ultimate version of erasure. You still are, but you can no longer matter. And for some, the awareness never fades. They track time. They remember birthdays. They listen to conversations around them that aren't meant for them. Doctors talking, family crying, decisions being made, and they lie there, watching, unable to respond. One patient, when finally able to communicate via eye movement, said, "I heard everything you said. Even when you thought I couldn't, I knew what year it was. I knew who visited and who didn't. I was there." We don't talk about this much, because it forces us to confront something uncomfortable, that the appearance of life, blinking, moving, speaking, is often all we recognize. We assume if someone can't respond, they aren't there. We erase them, functionally, because we don't know how to listen to silence. Locked-in syndrome is rare, but the pattern isn't. There are people right now, not paralyzed, not in hospitals, who feel the same. People who speak and are unheard. People who act and are unseen. People whose inner lives are rich and complicated, but go completely unacknowledged. This is the metaphysical version of the condition, the emotional, locked-in state. And it often starts early, with children who aren't listened to, partners who are ignored, patients who are dismissed. You don't need a stroke to feel like a ghost inside your body. You just need enough failed attempts to connect. Eventually, your world turns inward. You retreat, and the line between being ignored and being invisible starts to blur. So here's the question. If no one recognizes your voice, your thoughts, your feelings, are you still there, or are you locked in? Not in a hospital bed, but in your life. That's the paradox. Total obedience training. Learned helplessness as soul death. Let's get something straight. Obedience isn't always about fear. Sometimes it's about futility. Sometimes the person doesn't comply because they're afraid of punishment. They comply because they've forgotten they're allowed to disobey, because they've learned deeply, viscerally, that nothing they do will change the outcome. That's not discipline. That's learned helplessness. Let me tell you where that term comes from. In the 1960s, psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer ran an experiment on dogs. The dogs were placed in harnesses and subjected to mild electric shocks. Some dogs had a lever they could press to stop the shocks, others didn't. The next day, all the dogs were placed in a new box, one with a low wall. On one side, the floor delivered shocks. The other side was safe. The wall between them was short enough for the dogs to easily jump over. The ones who had learned they could stop the shocks, they jumped. The others, they didn't even try. They lay down, and they whimpered, and they took the pain, because they had already learned the rule. Nothing you do makes a difference. It wasn't just an experiment, it was a blueprint for psychological destruction. Now replace the dog with a child who cries and no one comes, who asks for help and gets silence, who tries to explain themselves and is mocked, or punished, or ignored. Eventually, the child stops crying, stops asking, stops explaining, and one day stops believing they matter. Not out of trauma, out of repetition. Learned helplessness doesn't come from a single moment. It's not the slap, or the scream, or the punishment. It's the slow accumulation of failed attempts to change your environment. It's the resignation that creeps in when hope becomes embarrassing. It's why some people stay in abusive relationships, why some patients stop taking their medication, why some workers stop reporting mistreatment, why some students stop raising their hands. Not because they're weak, because they've been conditioned. And once that switch flips, once the brain stops associating effort with outcome, it rewires itself. Even when escape becomes possible, they don't recognize it. Even when someone says, just leave or speak up or fight back, it doesn't compute. The mind has adapted to a hostile world by surrendering its agency. And now, that surrender feels like safety. In North Korean prison camps, survivors tell stories of prisoners who could have run, who were left alone for hours or even days near unlocked gates. But they stayed. Because escape wasn't just physically dangerous, it was psychologically inconceivable. They didn't see the opening. They saw the inevitability of punishment, of failure, of being crushed again. In abusive homes, children often stop trying to explain themselves, not because they've accepted guilt, but because they've learned explanations don't matter. The adult always wins. The story is always rewritten. Their version is always invalidated. So eventually, they stop having a version at all. And later, as adults, they may struggle to set boundaries. They may feel paralyzed in moments of conflict. They may tolerate unbearable conditions because they don't feel entitled to anything better. That's the quiet horror of this form of erasure. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks like exhaustion, like meekness, like someone who says, it's fine when it's clearly not, and when they say it enough, even they start to believe it. Now let me say something uncomfortable, directly to you. If you've ever stayed in a situation longer than you should have, if you've ever minimized your own pain to keep the peace, if you've ever known deep down that something was wrong but stayed silent anyway, you're not broken, you're trained. You were taught, probably slowly, probably subtly, that your resistance doesn't change anything. And so your mind adapted. It did what it had to do to survive. But that adaptation, it has a cost. Because obedience, once learned that deeply, doesn't stop at behavior. It reaches inward, to belief, to identity, to the idea of what you deserve. And soon you're not just complying. You're self-regulating your own erasure. You volunteer for the cage, and you thank them for letting you stay. Digital isolation. When no one replies, you don't have to be locked in a cell to be erased. Sometimes it just takes a phone. You send a message, nothing heavy, just something small. A meme, a thought, an invitation, a moment of vulnerability. And then, silence. You wait. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they missed it. Maybe, they're typing. You check. No bubbles. You check again. You see the little red icon, or the blue check marks. Or worse, you don't. And the clock starts to stretch. Minutes into hours, hours into days. You tell yourself it's fine. They're probably just overwhelmed. You try not to care, but you do. Because on some level your brain doesn't see it as a missed text. It sees it as social abandonment. This is digital isolation, and it's one of the most overlooked and most common forms of psychological erasure today. Because it's quiet, it's plausible, it's deniable. And it taps directly into the primal systems in your brain that evolved for tribal life, where being ignored didn't mean inconvenience. It meant exile. In evolutionary terms, being cut off from communication was a death sentence. Your nervous system doesn't distinguish between being ghosted in a group chat and being left behind in a forest. It just sees disconnection, and it panics. Researchers have found that social rejection online, even simple forms like being left out of a game or a conversation, activates the same brain regions as physical pain. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, these are not metaphorical responses. They are neurological screams. And what's more disturbing is how algorithmic this has become. You post a photo, it flops. You write something heartfelt. No one responds. You share your struggle. Silence. Or worse, a few pity likes. This kind of ambient invisibility is cumulative. It teaches you over time that your thoughts aren't needed, that your emotions are annoying, that your presence is optional. And so, just like with learned helplessness, you begin to adapt. You post less. You share less. You start typing and delete it. You scroll through the group chat, see people talking, joking, making plans, and somehow you're there, but not in it. And it's not dramatic. It's not a confrontation. It's a slow ghosting, a passive pruning of your social identity, until you're still in the room, but no one is speaking to you. And here's the trap. Because you're still technically connected, it's hard to name it. You still have followers, still get notifications, still appear on the list. But no one's really engaging with you. You've become part of the digital wallpaper. Present, but unread. Visible, but irrelevant. And it seeps inward. You start wondering, was I too much? Did I say something wrong? Should I be quieter, cooler, different? Eventually, you start shrinking before anyone can reject you. You pre-ghost yourself. You exit the call early. You stop checking in. You pretend you don't care, because indifference hurts less than hope. Let me show you how this compounds. Imagine a teenager, one who lives mostly online. Their friends are distant, their school life disconnected, their parents distracted, their identity forms around chats, posts, likes. One day they speak up about something personal, and the group ignores it, or worse, jokes about it, or just moves on. That child doesn't just feel embarrassed, they feel erased. And in that moment, they may begin to disassociate from their own voice. They may never post something vulnerable again. They may stop forming opinions. Because if no one will answer, why bother speaking? Now zoom out. An entire generation raised inside platforms that reward silence, exclusion, and superficial attention, where the illusion of being seen replaces the reality of being known, where the interface is present, but the connection is missing. This isn't accidental. This is engineered estrangement, because algorithms prioritize engagement, not intimacy. They show what performs, not what matters. And so millions of people drift further into silence, convinced they're talking to the void. And when that feeling becomes normal, they stop reaching out. Not because they're shy, because they believe no one is listening. That's how a human being can vanish, pixel by pixel. Not all at once, just a little less visible each day. Until eventually, they become a ghost in their own inbox. Still alive, still typing, still waiting. One more method, one more person swallowed by the void. But there's a different kind of banishment. Not digital, not accidental, deliberate. When a person is exiled, on purpose not for what they did but for who they are. And that kind of isolation, it doesn't just make you feel invisible. It convinces you that you were the problem all along. Let's talk about the psychological weapon of banishment. When exile becomes identity, the psychological weapon of banishment. Exile sounds like a punishment of distance, but in truth, it's a punishment of identity. You don't just lose your home, you lose your context, your credibility, your witnesses, your place in the story. Banishment doesn't say, "You're gone." It says, "You never belonged." That's what makes it so psychologically lethal. Let's start with a scene. A woman is cast out of her community. Not jailed, not beaten, just quietly removed. Her neighbors stop speaking to her. Her name becomes a whisper. Her presence becomes awkward. No one says why. No one has to. She tries to explain herself. No one listens. She tells her side. No one cares. Eventually, she starts to question whether she ever had a side to begin with. That's the mechanism. Banishment doesn't just push someone out. It isolates them so effectively that their own internal compass begins to spin. Let me show you how this works in systems of power. During the Stalinist purges, millions of people were not just imprisoned or executed, they were erased from photos, documents, even public memory. Their names were scraped from plaques. Their achievements reassigned. Entire families were discredited by association. These people weren't just exiled from a place. They were exiled from the story of history itself. When their relatives asked questions, the answer was simple. They never mattered. Or worse, they were dangerous all along. And here's where the psychological damage deepens. When everyone around you accepts the exile, even benefits from it, you begin to doubt your own past. You ask, was I really who I thought I was? Did I deserve this? Maybe they're right. This is what banishment does when weaponized effectively. It doesn't just remove you from society. It removes society from you. You lose reference points. You lose context. And soon, you lose the ability to frame your own experience. Let's come closer to home. A teenager is kicked out of their religious household after coming out. The family calls it tough love. The church calls it protecting the community. The teen is left sleeping on a couch, wondering not just how to survive, but if their identity caused it. That's the message of banishment. You were the toxin. You had to go. And that's how it reaches into the mind and begins to rewrite the self. Even after the exile ends, the narrative lingers. The person begins to shrink themselves in every room, preemptively. They avoid saying what they really think. They become experts at not offending. They train themselves to become agreeable, invisible, quiet, because they've learned that just being themselves is grounds for removal. And this tactic, this psychological weapon, is ancient. In tribal societies, exile was second only to execution. Sometimes it was execution, because without your people, your tools, your safety, death was inevitable. But it wasn't just physical death. It was symbolic death. In ancient Rome, exile exilium often meant more than banishment. It meant legal non-existence. You retained your body, but not your rights, not your status. You became, in effect, a living ghost, a warning to others. And that's exactly the point. Banishment is never just about the person who's removed. It's about everyone watching. It says, this is what happens when you break the frame. This is what happens when you make others uncomfortable. This is what happens when you refuse the script. And so it controls more than behavior. It controls identity formation. It teaches the group. Stay inside the lines. Blend in. Don't be difficult. Don't be them. Now here's the disturbing twist. Sometimes banishment isn't even explicit. It's just a pattern. You speak, and the conversation moves on. You share something real, and people say, that's heavy. You exist, and the room just tightens slightly. And over time, you begin to do the work for them. You stop sharing. You apologize for being too much. You keep the edges of your identity filed down, not out of fear, but out of a well-practiced understanding you are conditionally allowed. That is banishment in psychological form. Not distance, conditional presence, and eventually the person internalizes it so deeply, they begin to banish parts of themselves, their sexuality, their anger, their memories, their story. They exile these pieces to stay included and call it growth or maturity or just how life is. But it's not. It's survival through self-erasure. One more method, one more way to dismantle a person without laying a finger on them. But what happens when exile doesn't come from a society or a community or a belief system, but from someone who says they love you? What if the person who isolates you is the one you trust most? Let's talk about what happens when love is used as a tool of erasure. Isolation as a tool of love. When caregivers withdraw, not all isolation looks like neglect. Sometimes it looks like discipline. Sometimes it sounds like, I'm doing this for your own good. Sometimes it comes from the people who are supposed to love you. That's what makes it so hard to recognize, because when isolation is used by a caregiver, it's not framed as harm. It's framed as a lesson. Let's begin where it usually starts. Childhood. A child throws a tantrum. The parent, overwhelmed, says, go to your room. But the room isn't just a place to calm down. It's where the child is left, sometimes for hours. Alone, crying. No one checks. No one comes. No one explains. And the message is clear. You are only welcome when you behave right. Now multiply that over 1,000 tiny moments. Slammed doors, silent treatments, withheld hugs, the cold shoulder, not violence, not yelling, just removal. When parents withdraw affection in response to misbehavior or emotion, children don't learn self-regulation. They learn that connection is conditional. They don't learn boundaries. They learn that love can be revoked. And the psychological damage doesn't come from the timeout itself. It comes from the meaning the child assigns to it. When I'm in pain, I am left alone. When I express anger, I am punished with silence. When I cry, they disappear. This teaches a terrifying lesson. Your emotions will cost you connection, and so the child adapts. They learn to be quiet when they're sad, to hold in their anger, to present a version of themselves that's easy to be around. Because they've been trained to expect that love disappears the moment they're inconvenient. It's not malicious. Often it's generational. Parents use the tools they were taught. They don't realize that withdrawal, when paired with silence, can feel like psychological exile to a young mind. But it doesn't stop in childhood. Adults carry this conditioning into every relationship they enter. They become people pleasers, or emotional avoidance, or both, a constant loop of craving connection but fearing its withdrawal. They flinch when someone gets quiet. They spiral when texts go unanswered. They apologize even when they're the ones hurt, because in their internal map, conflict leads to abandonment. Not a loud, dramatic leaving, just vanishing. And sometimes they repeat the pattern, using isolation themselves as a tool. A partner argues with them. They withdraw. A friend offends them. They go cold. A child disobeys. They walk away, not to punish, to protect themselves. Because in their world, that's how pain is managed. Distance first, connection later, if ever. And this isn't always obvious. It happens in couples who stop speaking for days, in parents who withhold affection to teach a lesson, in mentors who ghost after disappointment, in friends who go silent when you say something they didn't want to hear, and it's not framed as cruelty. It's framed as boundaries, as self-care, as not wanting to say something we'll regret. But to the recipient, it's often indistinguishable from erasure. Because if every emotional misstep is punished by removal, then eventually you stop stepping. You go quiet. You become someone who doesn't cause problems. Someone who doesn't speak up when something hurts. Someone who doesn't ask for too much. Someone who disappears before they can be disappeared. That's how isolation, when used as a tool of love, doesn't just teach behavior, it rewires the nervous system. And over time, it creates adults who don't know the difference between solitude and abandonment, between emotional honesty and emotional danger, between love and fear of losing it. And maybe you recognize this in yourself. Maybe you flinch when someone says, "We need to talk." Maybe you fill silences with apologies. Maybe you preemptively suppress your feelings because you've learned the cost of being too much. That's not sensitivity. That's conditioning. That's the long-term effect of love tied to performance, connection made contingent on comfort. And here's the most disturbing part. When this pattern becomes normalized, the person may no longer know what healthy connection feels like, because when you've only known love as something that can be taken away, even stability feels suspicious. And when connection always comes with the threat of abandonment, you begin to abandon yourself, quietly, strategically. Until one day, there's no one left to isolate you. You do it preemptively. One more method, one more person erased. Not by punishment, but by conditional affection. That ends the first domain, isolation. But isolation is just the first step. The next is worse. Because after you've been cut off, after you've been silenced, ignored, ghosted, removed, the next move isn't to hurt you, it's to change your reality. Let's begin. Part 2. Reality distortion, destroying the map of the world. And let's start with the most precise psychological scalpel of all, gaslighting. Not manipulation, not lying, something far more dangerous. Let me show you how reality becomes a weapon, and how the first thing to vanish is your ability to trust yourself. Gaslighting, the weaponized denial of truth. When isolation fails, when silence isn't enough, there's a more elegant option. Don't remove the person, remove their grip on reality. Gaslighting isn't just lying. It's not confusion. It's not misremembering. It's a systematic attack on a person's ability to trust their own perceptions. It's psychological demolition. One denied memory at a time. Let me show you where the word comes from. In the 1944 film Gaslight, a husband secretly dims the gas lamps in the house. Every night, just a little. His wife notices. She says, "The lights are flickering." He says, "No, they're not." She hears footsteps in the attic. He says, "You're imagining things." Bit by bit, her trust in her senses begins to erode. And when he says she's going insane, she believes him. Because everything else already stopped making sense. That's gaslighting. It's not a disagreement. It's a deliberate attempt to erase someone's version of events and replace it with your own. And when done correctly, it doesn't just change what they believe, it changes how they believe. Let's start with something personal. Imagine waking up and noticing your favorite mug is missing. You ask your partner about it. They shrug. You never had a mug like that. You pause. You did, right? You check the cupboard. It's not there. You check old photos. None show the mug. You ask again. You always use the black one. They insist. You're probably mixing it up. Days pass. You begin to question other things. Did you leave the stove on yesterday? Did you pay the electricity bill? Did your friend really say that thing you remember? Your partner reassures you. You've been so stressed lately. You're remembering things wrong again. It's not abuse. It's concern. But the effect is the same. Your trust in your own memory begins to dissolve. And once that thread unravels, You stop arguing. You stop asking. You defer to the other person. Because if you can't trust your own senses, you have to trust theirs. This is where gaslighting becomes erasure. It doesn't erase the body. It erases the internal compass. And that compass is what the self depends on. In cults, gaslighting is common. The group tells you your family never really loved you, that your doubts are a sign of weakness, that your past was corrupted. Only they can give you truth. In authoritarian regimes, history is rewritten publicly and shamelessly. One week, a general is a hero. The next, a traitor. Books disappear. Photographs are altered. Entire events vanish from the official record. When people point out the contradiction, they're told, "You're mistaken, that never happened." Over time, this leads to epistemic collapse, a breakdown in the ability to know what's real. You start watching what others say before forming your own beliefs. You defer to authority even when it contradicts your eyes. You feel disoriented, unmoored. And once you stop trusting your perceptions, you become controllable because now anyone with confidence can write your story, and you'll believe it. Here's a real-world example. In abusive relationships, one of the most common patterns is retroactive gaslighting. The abuser does something harmful, screaming, threatening, cheating, then later denies it happened, or says the victim caused it, or reframes it as a misunderstanding. They say, "Why? I never said that. You're being dramatic. You're remembering it wrong. You made me do it." And over time, the victim begins to self-correct their memories. They edit out the abuse. They insert blame. They learn to distrust their own reactions. Eventually, they stop defending themselves because they're no longer sure what really happened. That's the final goal of gaslighting. Not just to change one event, but to create a reality gap where the victim floats in a space of permanent doubt. It's worse than lying, because lying tries to fool the listener. Gaslighting tries to erase the listener's confidence in ever knowing the truth again. You might be wondering, could this happen to me? It already has. Every time you've thought, "Am I overreacting?" Every time you've questioned whether something was real because no one else confirmed it, every time you've second-guessed your memory after someone confidently contradicted it, that was a flicker of gaslight. And some people live in that flicker, constantly. Especially when the gaslighter wears a mask of love, a partner, a parent, a therapist, a teacher. Because the more you trust the source, the faster your reality bends. Gaslighting doesn't have to be hostile. Sometimes it's delivered gently, with concern, with affection, with just enough plausible deniability that you start wondering if maybe, just maybe, you really are confused. And once that doubt sets in, you've already begun to disappear. One more method. One more mind cracked open, not by force, but by misalignment. Now let's sharpen the knife. What happens when you don't just doubt your memory, but your reflection? Let's talk about the mirror, and how the right kind of manipulation can make you look yourself in the eye and still not believe what you see. Mirror torture, making a person doubt their own face. There's a reason mirrors show up in horror stories, not because they're supernatural, but because they hold something terrifying, a reflection you can't trust. Most people think torture happens through pain, but the most disorienting kinds happen through perception. Not what's done to your body, but what's done to your sense of being real. Now imagine this. You're taken into a room with mirrors on all sides. At first it's fine, just strange. Then something subtle changes. The lights flicker. The mirror warps, just slightly. Not enough to notice at first. Your jaw looks off. Your eyes look wrong. You're not sure why. You speak. There's a delay. You smile. It doesn't feel like yours. And then the people behind the glass start commenting. "You've lost weight. Are you okay? You look sick. That's not how you normally look." And soon you start to wonder, what am I actually seeing? This isn't science fiction. This is mirror torture, and it's been used in both military and psychiatric contexts to destabilize the identity of detainees and patients. The principle is simple. If you can't recognize your own face, your self-concept begins to slip. In one notorious case at a black site, detainees were isolated in mirror chambers with altered lighting, warped glass, and disorienting sounds. Over time, they began to question whether the face they were seeing was even theirs. And that triggers something deeper than confusion. It triggers ontological panic, a terror that arises when your sense of self and body no longer match. Let's go deeper. As infants, one of the earliest developmental milestones is recognizing ourselves in a mirror. It marks the formation of the ego, the beginning of I. But what happens when that mirror is disrupted? In psychological experiments, even minor delays in mirrored feedback, a 500 millis lag in facial expression, can induce discomfort, anxiety, and even dissociation in healthy adults. In controlled settings, this technique has been used to induce temporary depersonalization, that eerie, detached feeling where your body feels foreign. Now imagine that effect extended, amplified. Weaponized. Prisons have used it. Interrogators have used it. Some cults have used it too, forcing members to stare at themselves in silence for hours during cleansing rituals until tears, fear, or hallucinations emerge. Because staring into your own face for too long, especially under duress, does something strange. It unravels familiarity. One study found that participants who stared at their own reflection in dim lighting for extended periods began to see distortions, other faces, animal features, shifting expressions. It's called the strange face illusion. Your brain starts to generate anomalies. Why? Because your visual processing system is designed for stability. When that stability is disrupted, your brain fills the gap with fiction. This isn't madness. It's prediction error. And if the person conducting the manipulation knows how to exploit that, they can make you doubt even your most basic anchor. That's me. Let's bring it home. You don't need a prison or a black site. In emotionally abusive relationships, mirror distortion happens through commentary. You look tired. Your face is weird today. Are you gaining weight? That's not what you looked like yesterday. It sounds superficial, but repeated often enough, it creates dissonance. And that dissonance eats away at self-recognition. It's not about beauty, it's about familiarity. Because when you look in the mirror and no longer feel connected to the face staring back, you begin to lose your story. You stop taking photos. You avoid mirrors. You ask others for validation you used to get from within. And once your visual identity becomes unstable, your psychological one follows. Because your face isn't just skin and bone. It's your social signature. It's the proof you're real. It's the mask the world knows. And if that mask becomes untrustworthy, so do you. So do your memories, your claims, your certainty. That's why mirror manipulation works. It makes you the unreliable narrator. And once that happens, they don't need to lie to you anymore. You'll do it yourself. One more method. One more person staring into a reflection and not recognizing who's looking back. Now let's expand the distortion. What happens when the confusion isn't visual, but verbal? When you're told two contradictory things and punished no matter which one you choose, let's talk about the double bind and how being forced to choose between lies breaks something deeper than logic. Deliberate conflicting messages, double bind theory. What if every choice you made was wrong? No matter what you say, it's the wrong thing. No matter how you behave, it gets you punished. And when you ask for clarity, you're told, you know what I mean. That's not just confusion, that's a double bind. The term comes from Gregory Bateson, a 20th century anthropologist and cyberneticist who studied paradoxes in human communication. He discovered that certain people, especially children in dysfunctional families, were often placed in situations where every possible response violated some expectation. It wasn't just pressure, it was logical entrapment. Let me give you a classic example. A mother hugs her son, but stiffens up. The child senses discomfort and pulls away. She then says, "Why are you pulling away? Don't you love me?" If the child accepts the hug, he violates his intuition. If he resists, he is accused of being cold. Either way, he's wrong. He learns that the truth of the situation, what he feels, what he sees, doesn't matter. What matters is performing the correct contradiction. And over time, this trains the brain into paralysis. Now take that into adulthood. A boss says, "I want you to take initiative." So you do. You make a decision without checking. They say, "Why didn't you follow the protocol?" Next time you ask. They say, "Why can't you think for yourself?" This is how obedience becomes impossible, and yet demanded. Now let's go darker. In interrogation scenarios, double binds are used deliberately. The detainee is told, "If you don't confess, we'll assume you're guilty. If you do confess, that's proof you were guilty all along." There is no exit, no correct answer, only submission. Because once the mind is forced into contradiction long enough, it does something tragic. It stops seeking truth and starts seeking safety. It stops trusting logic and starts guessing what the interrogator wants to hear. That shift from clarity to performance is what the double bind is designed to create. It's not meant to make sense. It's meant to break down your ability to expect sense. This shows up in cults. You're told, if you question the leader, you're betraying the truth. But the leader's words contradict themselves constantly. So you're stuck. To obey is to lie. To disobey is to be cast out. To stay silent is to become complicit. To speak is to be accused of pride. And so you learn to suppress thought. You learn to adapt your identity to the contradiction. This is the psychology of the double bind. It doesn't just confuse the mind, it rewires it. It creates an internal map where truth becomes irrelevant. What matters is survival. Saying the right thing at the right time to the right person, even if it contradicts what you said yesterday. And if you're wondering if this happens in families, it does. Especially in homes where a parent says things like, "You can tell me anything," and then punishes honesty. Don't bottle things up, but explodes at disagreement. "I love you no matter what," but withdraws affection during conflict. Children in these environments learn that reality is unstable. That language is a trap. That emotion is a risk. That connection is conditional, but the conditions change every day, and they carry that instability with them. They become adults who second-guess every email, every text, every look. They apologize preemptively. They replay conversations in their heads. They panic over ambiguity. Because they were trained in a logic where every path leads to punishment. That's not anxiety. That's conditioning. Now think about what that does to a person's ability to think critically, to stand up for themselves, to say, "This doesn't make sense." They don't, because they've learned that logic doesn't matter. What matters is guessing the mood of the moment. That's the deeper damage. Not the confusion, but the erasure of the expectation that things should make sense. And once that's gone, you can make someone believe anything, even their own guilt, even their own insanity, because they no longer trust their own reasoning. One more method, one more mind tied into knots, and told that it's their fault for not untying them fast enough. But what happens when the contradiction isn't just logical? What if it's social? What if you're told, "Everyone knows you're wrong," even if no one ever says it to your face? Let's talk about manufactured paranoia and how erasure can happen by making you believe that everyone else already erased you. Everyone knows but you. Manufactured paranoia. Sometimes no one has to hurt you. They just have to convince you that everyone else already has. That's the strategy behind manufactured paranoia, a psychological weapon that doesn't strike directly. It works through suggestion, through ambiguity, through whispers that never quite reach your ears. It's not violence. It's the illusion that you're being watched, judged, rejected by people you cannot name. Let me show you how it works. You walk into a room. The conversation stops. A few glances. A subtle shift. You can't prove it, but it feels off. You smile. Someone smiles back. Just a little late. You speak. Someone laughs too quickly, not at your words. Later, you text a friend. They take longer than usual to reply. When they do, They sound cold. Distant, you ask. Is something wrong? They say, no, not at all. Why would you think that? Now you feel paranoid. But also, right, because something is happening. You can feel it. This is how manufactured paranoia begins. And it only takes a seed, a single suggestion, a vague warning, a strategically timed silence. Just so you know, people have been talking. I wouldn't bring that up again if I were you. You don't know what they say behind your back. No specifics, no evidence, just the idea that you are out of sync and that everyone else knows something you don't. Your brain does the rest. This is what psychologists call reference paranoia, the belief that people are speaking about you, watching you, judging you, even when they're not. In clinical cases, it's associated with psychosis. But in manufactured environments, it can be deliberately induced. Let's look at cults. One technique used in cult indoctrination is triangulation, where the leader suggests that others in the group have doubts about you, but refuses to name them. Some people think you're not committed. I've heard things about your loyalty. Now you feel targeted. But you don't know by whom, so you withdraw. You second guess. You try to fix yourself. Even if nothing ever happened, because the damage isn't in what was said. It's in the internal surveillance it creates. You begin watching yourself on their behalf. You become your own censor, your own enforcer. Now let's take a historical example. During the East German Stasi era, state agents didn't just arrest people. They used a technique called Zersetzung, decomposition. It was a form of psychological warfare where the goal wasn't imprisonment. It was invisible collapse. The target might find their mail tampered with, their friends more distant, anonymous phone calls at night, their career quietly blocked, whispers spread. They wouldn't be accused. They'd be made to feel like everyone already knew they were guilty. Over time, some victims became paranoid. Some withdrew from social life. Some had breakdowns. But the state could say, we never laid a hand on them because they didn't have to. All they had to do was isolate someone socially and then make that isolation feel like consensus. Let's bring it into the personal. A manipulative partner doesn't need to scream. They just need to say, even your friends think you're too sensitive. I'm not the only one who sees how difficult you are. Everyone just tolerates you. Now imagine hearing that over and over, even if no names are mentioned, even if no evidence is offered. You start scanning every interaction for clues. You replay conversations. You look for signs. You try to change, just in case. That's the trap. The social map in your mind begins to distort. Neutral interactions feel threatening. Silence feels accusatory. Laughter in another room, you assume it's about you, even if you know it's not, because the feeling overrides the fact. And once you can no longer distinguish real rejection from imagined rejection, you isolate yourself. You stop asking for help. You stop being honest. You become easier to be around, not because you're calm, but because you've started erasing your own presence in advance. That's the final result. Not madness, not chaos. Strategic retreat. A person who no longer knows who's on their side, so they assume no one is, and live accordingly. One more method. One more person convinced they've already been erased, so they start doing it for you. But what happens when the instability doesn't come from suggestion? What if it comes from reality itself? What if the facts keep changing and the map of the world becomes a flickering mirage? Let's talk about what happens when truth becomes fluid and how propaganda, when done right, doesn't just lie to you. It makes reality itself unstable. When facts are fluid, propaganda as personal attack. Imagine a world where today's truth contradicts yesterday's, but you're expected to believe both. Where the facts don't just change, they never meant what you thought they meant. Where every correction is not a clarification, but a reversal. This isn't confusion. It's propaganda used as a personal attack, not just to mislead you. To scramble the world until you stop trusting your own grip on reality. Let's start with a sentence. We have always been at war with East Asia. That's from George Orwell's 1984. A fictional regime uses endless war as a tool of control. But more than that, it uses the constant rewriting of who the enemy is to destabilize the population's memory. Yesterday, they were at war with Eurasia. Today, it's Eastasia. Anyone who remembers differently is guilty of thought crime. You're not just expected to lie. You're expected to believe the lie and forget it was ever different. That's not just fiction. That's psychological strategy. Let's look at real history. In the Soviet Union under Stalin, public narratives were fluid by design. A high-ranking official could be celebrated one year, denounced the next, and completely erased from the record after that. Photographs were retouched, books revised, party slogans rewritten. If you noticed the change, you were dangerous. If you remembered the change, you were insane. And that's the deeper effect. Propaganda doesn't just install new truths, it installs doubt in the idea of truth at all. You don't just wonder what's real. You wonder if reality even exists outside of what you're told. Now zoom into the personal level. Imagine growing up in a household where rules change daily. One day, you're punished for not speaking up. The next, for speaking too much. You say, "But yesterday you said," and the response is, "Don't argue." This is how the same tool used by regimes is used in families, a kind of domestic propaganda where facts shift to serve control. That never happened. You're exaggerating. You're too sensitive. Everyone agrees with me. Truth becomes contextual. Who's in the room? What mood they're in? What role you're expected to play? So you learn to wait before reacting, to study faces, to sense the weather, to perform what fits. This is how the erosion begins. Not with lies, with conditional reality. And over time, you stop thinking of events as what happened. You start thinking of them as what they say happened. That's the goal. Because once you lose trust in your own memory, once you stop holding the present accountable to the past, you are fully programmable. Let's return to the political world. Modern authoritarian regimes, North Korea, Russia, China, often use this tactic. They'll deny something until they no longer need to. Then they'll admit it, but with a different frame. Yes, we imprisoned them for the good of the people. Yes, we rewrote the law because the old one was unjust. Yes, we changed our stance, and that proves we're evolving. And if you question the contradiction, you're accused of holding on to the past, which is now a crime. The contradiction isn't hidden. It's performed, because the performance itself is the control. It's not about making you believe the lie. It's about making you adapt to its existence. And once you adapt to a world where truth shifts beneath your feet, you stop planting anything real. You stop forming firm opinions. You stop challenging narratives. You begin to float, contextually moral, situationally sane. Not because you're weak, because you've been repeatedly punished for consistency. That's what propaganda as erasure really is. It's not just fake news. It's the psychological training that teaches you facts are negotiable. And if facts can be rewritten, so can your memories, so can your intentions, so can you. That's the real goal, not to replace your beliefs, to make you ashamed of having stable ones at all. One more method. One more mind slowly turned into mush, not by ideology but by epistemic exhaustion. But what happens when the unreality isn't just told to you? What if it's shared? What if whole groups, entire crowds, begin hallucinating together? Let's go further down the spiral. Let's talk about mass psychogenic illness, when belief spreads like a virus and erases reality by overwhelming it. Mass psychogenic illness, group hallucination as control. Sometimes, the best way to erase someone's reality is to replace it with everyone else's. Not through argument, not through evidence, through sheer, overwhelming consensus. If enough people believe something, you begin to question yourself. And if they don't just believe it but feel it, then you must be the broken one, the outlier, the problem. That's how mass psychogenic illness works. Not disease, Belief that behaves like disease. Let me show you. In 1962, in a village in Tanganyika, now Tanzania, a strange epidemic broke out in a girls' boarding school. It started with 3 students laughing uncontrollably, then more joined. Then they couldn't stop. Fits of laughter turned into tears, fainting, panic attacks. Within days, the school shut down. But it didn't stop there. It spread to nearby villages, other schools. Hundreds were affected. There were no toxins, no viruses, no bacteria, only minds reflecting each other and unraveling. This wasn't fakery. The symptoms were real. The fear, the convulsions, the breakdowns, all measurable, but the cause, contagious perception. The nervous system, overloaded by uncertainty, mirrors others to stay safe. If someone panics, your brain assumes there's a reason. If multiple people panic, your body reacts before your mind decides, and that's the horror. You don't need to believe in the threat for it to control you. You just need to feel what others are feeling. This phenomenon has happened again and again throughout history. In medieval Europe, nuns would break into fits of screaming and biting. One convent saw dozens of women meowing like cats for hours. Another broke into violent dancing. Monasteries reported mass hallucinations, devils, demons, snakes, with multiple victims confirming the same visions. No one faked it. They experienced it. Together, because someone had to be right and no one wanted to be the first to be wrong. In 1983, in West Bank Palestinian schools, over 900 girls fell ill with dizziness, fainting, and nausea. The Israeli military claimed it was hysteria. Palestinian officials claimed chemical warfare. Independent experts concluded mass psychogenic illness triggered by anxiety, mistrust, and tense political conditions. When the environment is volatile, reality becomes negotiable, and that's what makes it so easy to exploit. You don't need a virus, you just need the right story. Let's bring it closer to now. A strange noise is heard in a U.S. embassy in Havana. Diplomats report dizziness, memory problems, nausea. Some claim brain damage. Media runs with the story, sonic weapon attack. But experts found no weapon, no radiation, no toxins. The likeliest cause, a classic case of psychogenic illness, sparked by suggestion, stress, and group feedback. The fear became realer than the facts. And that's the key. Mass psychogenic illness doesn't just cause individual symptoms. It creates shared delusion, group consensus that overrides personal perception, and once that consensus is in place, it becomes a tool, not just a symptom, a weapon of control. Cults use this constantly. One member feels a presence. Others confirm it. One person reports a sign, a dream, a spiritual vision. The group rallies around it. They don't fake it. They feel it. And any dissenter? They're accused of spiritual blindness, of pride, of denial. Even if they see nothing, they feel pressure to conform. And slowly, the collective perception becomes stronger than reality. That's not belief. That's epistemic collapse. And it's not limited to fringe groups. Modern media ecosystems, tightly filtered, emotionally charged, algorithmically sorted, create feedback loops where mass belief forms around things that never happened. And the more people believe it, the more impossible it becomes to question. Try arguing with a crowd who all saw the same thing you didn't. Try doubting the video everyone shared, even if it's edited. Try standing against a mob that's fully convinced something evil occurred. You'll feel crazy, because they can't all be wrong, right? But yes, they can. And that's why mass psychogenic delusion is so dangerous. Because it makes the victim feel alone in the truth and pressured to adopt the lie just to survive. That's how mass belief becomes personal erasure. You begin to silence your instincts. You adjust your language. You nod along, and bit by bit, you become the new reality. Not because you were persuaded, but because the weight of everyone else's certainty became too much. That's how they erase you, not with isolation, with belief that swarms. One more method, One more person pulled into the current, not because they didn't know what was real, but because everyone else agreed it wasn't. But there's another way contradiction becomes a weapon. Not through mass hysteria, through deliberate paradox, logical traps where every response makes you guilty. Let's talk about the Kafka trap and how to turn questioning into a confession. Weaponizing contradiction, the Kafka trap. You're accused of something. Maybe it's vague. Maybe it's devastating. You say, "That's not true." And the response is immediate. Of course you'd say that. That's what guilty people do. Now you're stuck, because if you deny it, it proves you're guilty. If you stay silent, it proves you're guilty. If you get angry, it proves you're guilty. There is no answer that doesn't loop back into your guilt. You've just walked into a Kafka trap. Named after Franz Kafka, the Czech writer who perfected the art of bureaucratic horror, stories where characters are tried, punished, or executed without ever understanding the charge. In his novel The Trial, Joseph K. is arrested one morning. No one tells him why. He is shuffled between meaningless hearings and contradictory officials, punished for breaking rules that are never explained. His guilt is not based on evidence. His guilt is assumed. And that's the trap. The more you try to prove your innocence, the deeper you fall into suspicion. This isn't just fiction. It's a real and deliberate technique used in authoritarian systems, abusive relationships, ideological purges, and psychological warfare. It works by reversing the burden of proof. You're not innocent until proven guilty. You're guilty until you admit guilt, and even then your confession is used to justify what was already done to you. Let's take a historical example. During China's Cultural Revolution, people were often accused of bourgeois sympathies or thought crimes. These weren't legal violations, they were ideological impurities. If you denied it, that was proof. Why are you so defensive? Only someone who has something to hide would argue, so they confessed. Publicly, tearfully, under pressure. But the confession didn't restore their innocence. It became a trophy, used to show the righteousness of their punishment. The trap worked perfectly. Now zoom into the personal. In abusive relationships, this same structure emerges. Why are you always so controlling? You say, "I'm not trying to be." Exactly. You don't even see it. The more you explain, the more it becomes proof that you don't understand. Your disagreement becomes evidence that you're blind to your own behavior. It's circular, self-reinforcing, and devastatingly effective. Because once this logic takes hold, there's no way out. No apology is accepted. No silence is respected. No protest is heard without being turned against you. And here's where it gets worse. The person being accused begins to internalize the structure of the trap. They start doubting their own motivations. They begin thinking, maybe I am the problem, even if they know the charge is false. Because what Kafka understood, and what real-world manipulators exploit, is that when someone is caught in a world where every action proves their guilt, they don't just lose freedom, they lose their sense of reality. They stop trying to explain. They stop defending themselves. They learn to perform guilt because guilt is safer than resistance. And once you start performing guilt, even when you don't believe in it, it eats you from the inside out. That's what the Kafka trap is built to do. It's not just a rhetorical trick, it's a psychological cage. Because it doesn't matter what you did, it only matters what you are accused of. And once the accusation sticks, everything you say becomes a reaction to it. And every reaction makes you look worse. Let's take a modern example. Online discourse. You're accused of bad intent, racism, sexism, prejudice, betrayal. You say, "That's not what I meant." Why are you centering yourself? Typical deflection. Even your apology shows how out of touch you are. Now it's not about the original issue, it's about your reaction. And your reaction will always be wrong. Not because it's dishonest, because the structure has already declared it inadmissible. And when enough people reinforce that loop, when friends stay silent, when the crowd piles on, your sense of orientation breaks down. You become like Kafka's Joseph K., still talking, still pleading, but no longer sure what crime you've been put on trial for. That's how the trap becomes erasure. You're not silenced directly. You're left speaking into a system that translates everything you say into guilt. And once that happens, you stop speaking. Not because you've lost your voice, because there's no one left to hear it as anything but proof that you're wrong. One more method, one more mind caught in a loop that was never meant to be escaped. But what happens when your memories start slipping? Not because someone lied to you or twisted your words, but because entire groups of people remember something that never happened. Let's talk about the Mandela effect and how shared misremembering, when it reaches critical mass, doesn't just make you question your brain, it makes you question the stability of reality itself. The Mandela effect is social gaslighting. You're sure you remember it. You can picture it vividly, the logo, the quote, the scene, and yet you're wrong. But you're not alone. Thousands, maybe millions of people remember the exact same thing, and it never happened. That's the Mandela effect. Named after a bizarre mismatch in collective memory, many people, especially online, remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s. They remember the news coverage, the funeral, the speeches. But Mandela didn't die in the 80s. He was released, became president of South Africa, died peacefully in 2013. The memory is false, but it's not just false, it's shared. And that's what makes it powerful. It's not the forgetfulness of an individual mind, it's the convergence of multiple minds around a fictional past. Let's explore more. You remember the Monopoly man, right? Top hat, cane, and a monocle? He never had a monocle, or the famous line from Star Wars, "Luke, I am your father." It was never said. The real line is, "No, I am your father." What about the Berenstain Bears? Spelled like Einstein. No, it's Berenstain. With an A. People swear these changes are wrong. They'll bet money. They'll quote it. They'll argue. But every source says otherwise. So what's happening here? Some say it's harmless. Memory errors. Minor glitches. But look closer. This is a crack in the foundation of mental stability. Because if your memory, something you felt, something you saw, something you trusted, can be that wrong, what else can't you trust? Memory isn't a tape recorder. It's a reconstruction. Every time you recall something, you alter it a little. And the more confident you are, often the more wrong you are. Worse, memory is social. If enough people remember something the same way, it reinforces itself. It gets repeated, quoted, printed on memes, referenced in jokes. Soon, the false memory becomes more familiar than the truth, and that's where the danger begins. Because memory isn't just about trivia, it's the glue of your identity. If you can doubt a cartoon you grew up with, you can doubt a conversation, a friendship, a trauma, a decision you swore you made for good reasons. The Mandela effect isn't just about fun internet debates, it's a preview of what happens when certainty erodes, and in some hands, it can be used. A skilled manipulator doesn't need to erase your memory, they just need to flood your world with people who remember it differently. They can say, "That's not how it happened. Nobody said that. You're remembering wrong." And when you say, "I know what I saw," they won't argue. They'll just show you a room full of others nodding along. In time, you'll wonder, maybe I'm misremembering. Maybe I made it up. Maybe I'm the crazy one. That's when the fracture sets in. Not because you were lied to, because the past itself stopped being reliable. The Mandela effect makes memory feel negotiable, and when enough of your mind becomes negotiable, it's easier to shape. You'll start waiting to see what others remember before trusting your own version. You'll hesitate when asked to recall something. You'll revise your story to match the crowd. And slowly, without force, without threats, your memory becomes collective fiction, which is far more powerful than forgetting, because forgetting is passive. But this is remembering the wrong thing with confidence. It's belief weaponized. History rewritten not in books, but in brains. And there's no eraser that works better than one you willingly pick up. Which brings us to the next step. If memory can be warped by mass agreement, what happens when your behavior is interpreted and then fed back to you in a distorted loop? What if every time you try to prove you're sane, someone says, "That's exactly what a crazy person would do"? Let's talk about false feedback loops, when every signal becomes misread. And sanity itself starts to look like madness. False feedback loops, making sanity look like madness. You stay calm during the argument. Too calm. See, you're emotionally shut down. That's not normal. So next time you raise your voice, trying to be real, trying to show you care. Wow, so aggressive. This is exactly the volatility I was talking about. Now you're confused, so you withdraw. Avoidant again. You never take responsibility, and that's the trap. Whatever you do is interpreted as evidence that something is wrong with you. This is a false feedback loop, a system where you are measured by your reactions, and your reactions are redefined until they always mean failure. And the most disturbing part, it feels like logic. It pretends to be insight. It wears the mask of therapy, of reason, of fairness, but underneath, it's psychological sabotage, a mirror that doesn't reflect, but distorts. This isn't just interpersonal manipulation. It happens in institutions, in courtrooms, in medical diagnoses, in child custody battles, in political discourse, and in the slow mental collapse of anyone who tries to survive a world that always twists their intentions into pathology. Let me show you. A woman reports to HR that her boss is harassing her. She's collected emails, notes, even voice messages. She's detailed and composed. The report says she's rehearsed, seems manipulative, too polished. Next time she comes in shaking, crying. Emotional instability, not credible, possibly exaggerating. So she tries to find balance, calm but clear. Flat effect. Maybe she's dissociating. Her every attempt to navigate the system becomes proof that she doesn't belong in it. The loop has no exit. Because her behavior is not being judged, it's being interpreted through a lens that already decided she's unreliable. Now imagine living inside that loop. Imagine every word, every silence, every facial expression filtered through suspicion, and you can never find the right tone. This is common in psychiatric systems. The patient says, "I feel like I'm being watched." The chart says, "Paranoid ideation." So they stop saying it. Try to sound normal. The chart says, "Withholding information." They try honesty again, but now the doctor notes, "Increased distress." There's no correct answer, because the feedback isn't neutral. It's already rigged. And here's the twist. When you know you're being watched, when you know you're being analyzed, you begin to adjust yourself preemptively. You change your tone. You edit your reactions. And then those edited reactions become more fuel for the system to call you fake, avoidant, inconsistent. So now your own attempts to survive the trap become its justification. This is how sanity gets reclassified as evidence of illness. It's not a diagnosis, it's a mirror house where every turn you take just leads to another warped reflection. It's the whisper that says, if you were really sane, you wouldn't need to prove it. And if you argue, defensiveness noted. If you're quiet, uncooperative. If you cry, manipulative. There is no authentic self that can pass through this filter unshredded, because it's not looking for who you are. It's looking for confirmation of what it already believes. And that's how false feedback loops erase you, not by silencing you, but by convincing you that everything you do is the wrong thing to do. And the longer you live inside that loop, the more you start to believe it. You stop trusting your gut. You second-guess every tone of voice, every pause, every text you send. Until eventually, you begin acting like someone who actually is unstable. Not because you were made to play the role of someone falling apart. All the system did was hand you a script and wait for you to rehearse it. And if you think that's the bottom of the mind trap ladder, think again. Because there's one final technique in this segment of reality distortion. What if you couldn't even describe what's happening to you? What if language itself broke down and you were left with no words for the pain, the injustice, the erasure? Destroying language. When you can't name what's happening, you're in pain. You feel it. You know it, but you can't explain it. You try to speak, but the words sound dramatic, clumsy, inadequate, so you hesitate. Then stop. Then start to wonder if maybe you're just being too sensitive. This is how minds are erased without a sound. Not by cutting out the tongue, but by making language unable to carry meaning. Language is how we point to what's real. It's how we build categories, tell stories, share pain, ask for help. But what happens when those words are taken away? Or worse, when they are redefined? Here's an example. An employee is being subtly undermined at work. She's excluded from meetings, copied late on emails, given contradictory instructions. She goes to HR. They call it a miscommunication. Later, a personality mismatch. Eventually, a perception issue. None of those words describe what's happening. What's happening is called gaslighting, or maybe institutional sabotage, or abuse of power. But those words are too sharp, so the system blunts them, erases them. And now, she has to argue not just for her experience, but for the right to describe it accurately. This happens everywhere. Racism becomes cultural misunderstanding. Sexism becomes leadership style. Grief becomes emotional instability. Violence becomes discipline. Every time a sharp word is replaced with a soft one, a layer of clarity disappears. And when you take enough of those layers away, you're left with silence. But this isn't just about euphemisms. It goes deeper. In Orwell's 1984, there's a concept called newspeak, a deliberately engineered language designed to make rebellion unthinkable. Words like freedom, justice, or truth are stripped of meaning or never existed at all, because if you don't have a word for freedom, you can't demand it. You can't even miss it. That's the horror. Not just losing your rights, but losing the ability to know you've lost them. The technique is used everywhere. Language can be reshaped by force or by influence. In authoritarian regimes, criticism is labeled fake news or foreign propaganda. In abusive families, cruelty is called tough love. In cults, questioning is renamed ego or resistance. In each case, the victim is linguistically disarmed. You want to say, "This is wrong," but the only words available to you are permitted ones that describe your pain as your own fault. Eventually, you begin to censor yourself before you even speak. You pause at the sentence that once felt natural. You correct your vocabulary mid-thought. You avoid words that feel too much, too strong, too dramatic, not because they're wrong, but because you've been trained to believe that words like those are inappropriate. Now imagine a child growing up in a house where sadness is called weakness, anger is disrespect, confusion is laziness, fear is drama. What vocabulary will they grow into? How will they ever ask for help if every emotion they feel comes with the wrong label? By adulthood, that child doesn't just lack expression. They lack recognition. They feel hollow, displaced, overwhelmed, but can't say why. They have been erased through the map of their own mind. Because that's what language is. It's the map. It's how you name the monsters. And when someone rewrites that map, you're lost. Not just in the world, but inside yourself. And once you're lost in your own mind, the erasure is nearly complete. Because without words to describe what's happening, how do you fight back? How do you even know it's happening? This isn't just a chapter about language. It's about narrative control. About the difference between saying, "Isiri, he touched me," versus "we had a complicated relationship." Or the difference between "Isiri, I was silenced," versus "Isiri, I didn't know how to explain myself." See how quickly reality slips. That's the final step of reality distortion. Not to make you believe a lie, but to make you unable to say the truth. So the next time someone tells you that words don't matter, remember this. If someone can take your language, they don't need to take anything else, because they've already taken you. Now we move deeper, because once reality has been distorted, memories become vulnerable. Let's explore how memory itself, the very record of who you are, can be manipulated, erased, rewritten, not with trauma, but with suggestion. Stripping names and histories, the blank slate tactic. It starts with something simple. That's not your name anymore. And just like that, you're no longer who you were. The records are gone. Your nickname, your signature, the stories that followed you, gone. They give you a new name, a new uniform, a new role. And if you resist, they smile. You'll adjust. This is the blank slate tactic. And it's not new. It's ancient. In every system of total control, cults, prisons, military camps, colonization programs, psychiatric institutions, the first step isn't pain, it's renaming. Because if they can erase your name, they've already cracked the spine of your story. Let's start with history. In the Atlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans were forcibly renamed the moment they were sold. Karami became John. Amina became Mary. Their birth names were too foreign, too complicated, too black. The new names were easier. What that meant was easier to own. Those names had no ancestors, no memories, no tribal lineage, just a blank surface, one that could be rewritten however the master pleased. Now fast forward, look at cults. One of the first steps in joining a cult is losing your old name. You become Hope, Joy, Silas, number 8. You're told this is spiritual rebirth, but it's not rebirth. It's erasure with consent. Because once you start referring to yourself in the new name, over and over, something shifts. You stop reacting to the old one. You feel distant from who you used to be, and that's the point. The tactic isn't about the name itself. It's about breaking the thread between your current self and your previous identity. If they can convince you that your past doesn't matter, or worse, never existed, then your sense of self becomes detached from time. And a self detached from time is a self that floats, unmoored, and open to reprogramming. Let's go further. In residential schools for indigenous children, especially in North America and Australia, children were not just forbidden from speaking their native languages, they were renamed, forced to wear Western clothes, told their old beliefs were demonic, that their ancestors were savages, that they were lucky to be civilized. These weren't just physical restrictions, they were psychic amputations. Children returned to their communities not just changed, but disconnected. No name, no language, no myth, no bridge home. This is how you kill a people without killing their bodies. You just make them forget who they are. And here's the cruel twist. When someone tries to reclaim what was stolen, their name, their language, their culture, they're told, "But why are you stuck in the past?" The blank slate tactic doesn't just erase your identity. It gaslights your desire to reclaim it. It says, "Be grateful. You're a new person now. Start fresh." But humans don't start fresh. We are built on story. We are memory in motion. And when you remove the story, the timeline, the name, the history, you don't liberate the person, you hollow them. They can walk, they can talk, they can function, but ask them, who are you, really? And there's a pause. Too long. That's how you know something has been taken. And that's just the beginning. Because once your name has been rewritten, the next step is even darker. You're told, you never really knew yourself at all. The forced persona. You're not who you think you are. You sit in the interrogation room. They show you photos, letters, names. You recognize all of it. But every time you speak, the response is the same. That's not who you are. At first, you resist. You explain yourself. You tell stories, recount birthdays, memories, people who could vouch for you. They shake their heads. You've been misled. You've been pretending. The real you is someone else. And this continues, hour after hour, day after day. Until the strangest thing starts to happen. You pause before answering. You start to wonder, what if they're right? This is the forced persona. And it's one of the most disturbing ways to unmake a mind, not by erasing memories, not by silencing thought, but by replacing the self with an artificial one and telling the person they've finally discovered who they truly are. It sounds absurd, but it works. Let's take a real example, the case of Patty Hearst. In 1974, she was kidnapped by a radical group calling themselves the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army. She was kept in a closet, blindfolded, threatened with death. Weeks later, she emerged, not as a rescued hostage, but as a committed member of the group, brandishing a gun during a bank robbery. She even took a new name, Tanya. Was it Stockholm Syndrome? Brainwashing? Was it real belief? Hard to say. But what's clear is this: something inside her was rewritten, not erased, not destroyed. Rewritten. And that's the point. The human mind doesn't need violence to be rewritten. All it needs is a new story loud enough to drown out the old one. This is exactly how cults reprogram identity. In the beginning, they love bomb you, tell you how special you are, how gifted, how misunderstood by the world. They say things like, "You're not who your parents told you you were. The world tried to cage you, but we see the real you." And slowly they install a new version of you. One who doesn't ask questions. One who distrusts outsiders. One who feels relief in surrendering individuality. Soon, your thoughts change. You speak their phrases. You dress like them. You laugh when they laugh. And worst of all, you start to think that your old self was naive, fake, unformed. You look back on who you used to be and feel shame. That's when the replacement is complete. And it's not just cults. It happens in relationships. In controlling marriages, a partner may start by mocking your old friends, your taste in music, your fashion, your career, just little jabs. Then they suggest new clothes, new opinions, a new job. And eventually you start to change, not because you wanted to, but because it became easier to let go of who you were than keep defending it. You end up looking in the mirror and seeing someone you don't recognize. And the voice behind you says, "This is the real you. I helped you become it." And maybe the scariest part, you believe them. It also happens in psychological torture, especially in military or intelligence interrogation. Prisoners are told, "You're not who you think you are. You're not a father, a citizen, a soldier. You're weak. You're broken. You've always been this way. We're just helping you see it." And if repeated long enough, through exhaustion, manipulation, and total environmental control, people start to confess things they didn't do because they're not sure anymore what's real. That's not just gaslighting. That's persona replacement, a psychological version of identity theft, except you participate in the rewriting because the story becomes seductive. It says, "Stop fighting who you were, be who we say you are." And over time, you do. You cut your hair. You speak with new inflection. You forget old jokes, old fears, old beliefs. You delete posts, change numbers, distance yourself from the people who might remind you of what used to be true and the person you used to be. They don't disappear all at once. They fade. Until one day someone says, "Hey, do you remember when?" And you feel a strange chill. Because you don't remember. Or worse, you do. And it doesn't feel like you anymore. This is how minds are rewritten. Not by force, but by shame, suggestion, and praise, until you willingly bury yourself under a mask they handed you. And you say thank you. Now let's go deeper. Because once they've given you a new identity, they can trap you inside it with just 4 walls, a book of doctrine, and no mirrors. The thought reform cell, cult re-identification. You're in a room. There are no windows, only a dim light, a few books, and a voice that repeats the same truths day after day. Outside the room, people speak a new language. Inside, you start to hear your own voice echoing theirs. At first it's mimicry, then it's memorization, Then belief. That's how thought reform works, and it's not metaphor, it's method. Thought reform is the systematic dismantling of a person's beliefs, identity, and worldview, followed by their reconstruction as a new person, tailored to the group's needs. The most notorious version of this came from 20th century Maoist China, where political prisoners were sent to re-education camps, not for punishment, but for transformation. "We are not here to hurt you," the officials would say. "We are here to help you correct your thoughts." In these camps, people were placed in cells of agreement, surrounded by fellow prisoners, trained to enforce group doctrine. Every day they were made to confess their former errors. Every night they were made to write down how their thinking had improved. Eventually, they began to say things like, "I'm grateful for this opportunity to see the truth. I now understand how wrong I was. I used to be confused, but now I see." And that's how you know it's working, because once someone voluntarily participates in their own erasure, you don't need chains. The philosopher Robert J. Lifton studied survivors of Chinese re-education and found a terrifying pattern. At first they resisted, then they complied, then they believed, then they converted others. By the end, many of them couldn't distinguish between what they had been forced to say and what they truly believed. Their thoughts had been rewritten, not by argument, but by social pressure, emotional exhaustion, and isolation. That's the thought reform cell. And it's not just political. Modern cults do the same thing. You're isolated from family. You're surrounded by brothers and sisters who smile too much. You sleep little, eat less. Your time is filled with doctrine, service, repetition, confession. You're told your old self was broken, that your doubts are spiritual blocks, that your pain is a sign of transformation, and slowly, you change. You repeat slogans you never used to say. You believe things that once made no sense. You look at outsiders with pity. You become a missionary for your own captors. Because that's the goal, not obedience, but identification. They don't want you to follow orders. They want you to believe you were born to follow them. And this goes even deeper in totalitarian systems. In North Korea, for example, people are not just expected to obey the regime. They are trained from birth to love the supreme leader. Emotionally, spiritually, personally. Children are made to sing songs of praise every morning. Family members spy on each other. Confessions are public. Doubts are treasonous. And if you grow up in that, you don't think it's strange. You think it's normal because you've never known anything else. That's the final horror. When the reform cell becomes invisible because the person inside it can no longer imagine a self that isn't shaped by it. And that's what identity shattering really is. Not wiping your memory, not suppressing your voice, but replacing the internal compass that tells you who you are with a scripted map that always leads back to them. You become their message, their proof that the system works. And you smile as you say it. But sometimes, the illusion breaks. A photo, a smell, a forgotten name whispered in a dream, and you remember. I used to be someone else, but the thought slips away. Because in this new world, the one built around your reformed thoughts, there's no room for the old you. Only a memory, quickly fading. Let's continue. Because in some systems, even that fragile memory is too much, so they go further and rewrite the past itself. Altering photographs and records, rewriting the past. You're flipping through a photo album. You see yourself at a party, laughing, arms wrapped around people you swear you remember. But one face has been blurred, another cut out, and the caption says something different than you recall. You pause. Try to remember. Did that person really exist? Are you misremembering? Or is something more deliberate happening? This is psychological retro-editing, the act of reshaping the past to reshape a person's present identity. Let's start with the most famous example. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, history wasn't just written, it was rewritten over and over as power shifted. Old comrades were purged from the party, and then from photographs. A famous image shows Stalin standing beside three men. A year later, one is removed. A few years after that, another vanishes. By the final version, only Stalin remains. These weren't just changes to media. They were surgical edits to memory. Because people began to wonder, was he really there? Did we misremember? Should we even talk about it? And when the past becomes fluid, the mind has no solid ground to stand on. This isn't just politics, it's identity warfare. Now imagine you grew up in a place where your childhood photos were taken away, your name was changed, your school records destroyed, your journals burned. People stopped referring to you by your old nickname. Every physical trace of your story was removed. What would happen? First, you'd feel anger, then disorientation, then doubt. Eventually, you might start to believe the new version. Because your memory is a fragile thing, and when external evidence conflicts with internal truth, your brain defaults to what's verifiable. And when the only verifiable thing left is a lie, you believe the lie. This tactic is used in cults, dictatorships, even abusive relationships. One partner deletes old photos of their victim's family, rewrites the past in conversation. Your sister never cared about you. You always hated that place. You told me you wanted this life. And if it's repeated long enough, the victim begins to echo it. They say things like, I used to think I liked that, but now I'm not sure. Or maybe I imagined that memory. That's not memory loss. That's engineered amnesia. Here's a disturbing twist. In digital life, this tactic is becoming more powerful and more invisible. Because now, photos can be altered in seconds. Captions can be changed. Comments deleted. Entire friend groups resorted by algorithm. One day you see a memory on Facebook. You don't remember taking the photo. You're not sure why that person is tagged. But the timestamp, the likes, the algorithm all confirm this happened, so you accept it, even if something in your gut feels off. And that's the dark truth. Once the archive becomes editable, the past becomes programmable, and a programmable past means a programmable self. Because who we are isn't just shaped by what we remember, it's shaped by what we can prove we remember. No photos? It didn't happen. No record? It's not real. No one else remembers. Then maybe it's just in your head. And once you're isolated inside your own unverified memories, you become easy to reprogram. In George Orwell's 1984, there's a moment when the protagonist is shown a photo, proof of the party's lie, only to see it destroyed seconds later. That act, the deletion of contradiction, is not just censorship, it's psychological conquest. The message is clear. The past only exists if we allow it to. And so you stop trusting your memory, stop trusting your gut, and eventually stop trusting yourself. That's the real damage. Not that the lie is believed, but that the truth no longer matters. You're not a person with a past. You're a character waiting for your story to be updated. And what comes next is even more intimate. Because while rewriting records is external, the next tactic reaches inside the person to break the very narratives that shape their childhood self. The breaking of childhood narratives. Let's say you remember your mother tucking you in at night, humming softly while brushing your hair. That memory feels warm, steady, safe. It's not just a scene. It's a cornerstone of how you understand love, safety, family. Now imagine someone tells you convincingly that this memory is false. They say, she wasn't there. She left you alone most nights. You made up the song to cope. She told people she wished you were never born. At first you reject it, but they show you letters, voicemails, testimonies from relatives. The evidence starts to corrode your certainty. The memory begins to rot. And now, that moment of safety becomes a question mark. Was I ever really loved? That's how it starts. This is the breaking of childhood narratives, a method of psychological dismantling that targets the most foundational stories in your sense of self. Because as children, we don't just experience life, we explain it to ourselves in stories. My dad protects me. I'm the smart one. Our family sticks together. I was chosen. I was safe. These aren't just memories, They're identity scripts. We carry them into adulthood, often without examining them. They become the reason you push through pain, trust people, expect certain things from life. So what happens when someone breaks those stories? You don't just lose your childhood, you lose your place in your own mind. This tactic shows up often in abusive relationships, especially where the abuser tries to dominate not just the present, but the victim's entire life narrative. They say, your father never protected you, he just controlled you. Your mom let it happen. You were never safe. All your achievements were just ways to get attention. And suddenly, the victim begins to look at their entire life through a new lens of betrayal. What once gave them pride now feels like manipulation. What once gave them comfort now feels like denial. This is a form of identity acid. It doesn't burn all at once. It drips, slowly, until even the strongest memories start to dissolve. You'll also see it in cults and authoritarian regimes. Many cults ask new recruits to revisit their past and reinterpret it. Your parents were part of a broken system. The love you thought you had was conditional. We are your real family now. By reframing the past as trauma and the present as rescue, they create a loop where the new identity feels redemptive. You're not losing your past. You're being freed from a lie. But that illusion is what seals the trap, because once the past has been discredited, there's nothing left to return to. No baseline, no memory immune from reinterpretation, no original you. That's the danger. Because we like to think our identity is built on hard facts like age, name, birthplace. But what truly defines you are things like who held you when you cried, what you believed about your worth at age 5, what you thought love looked like. These aren't data points, they're narratives, and they're fragile. In psychological torture settings, interrogators often target childhood stories on purpose. They'll ask about your parents, siblings, early memories, and then twist those stories just enough to make you question them. Because once you start thinking, maybe that didn't happen the way I remember, you're no longer grounded. You become reprogrammable. And sometimes the damage is internal. Victims of abuse who later learn they were manipulated or lied to in childhood often report a second wave of trauma. Everything I believed about my life was wrong. That kind of realization doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes the personality. It creates a floating identity, no longer tethered to any coherent origin, and floating identities are easy to claim by a cult, a partner, a regime, a therapist, a belief system. Whoever gets there first with a new story, and once you accept it, even out of exhaustion, you don't just forget the old narrative. You begin to hate it, mock it, delete it. You say things like, I was never that person. That wasn't me. I finally woke up. But underneath that new identity is a child, still waiting for someone to say, why I believe your story. And until that happens, the mind stays fractured, a collage of rewritten memories and self-doubt. Next, we move from childhood to culture. Because once personal identity is broken, the next layer is your group identity, your language, your history, your people. And when that is taken through schools, laws, punishments, and forced assimilation, what's left is a body with no home. Erasing cultural identity. Assimilation as erasure. You're born into a language you didn't choose. You grow up with foods that feel like home, holidays that mark time, names that mean something only to your people. You don't think of it as culture. You think of it as reality. Until someone tells you, that's not how we do things here. That name's too hard to pronounce. You'll need to speak properly if you want to succeed. And little by little, your world begins to shrink. This is assimilation, but not the kind you were taught in school. Not blending, not sharing. Erasure. Forced cultural assimilation is one of the oldest and most efficient tools of psychological control ever invented. Because when you destroy a person's culture, you don't just delete folklore or food, you delete context. And a person without cultural context is like a file with no metadata, easily misread, easily rewritten. Let's take a disturbing example. Indigenous boarding schools in the United States and Canada. From the late 1800s to well into the 20th century, Native American and First Nations children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to residential institutions. There they were beaten for speaking their native language, given English names, told their traditions were savage, subjected to forced haircuts, uniforms, Christian teachings. One administrator famously said the goal was to kill the Indian, save the man. Think about that. Kill the Indian, save the man. It wasn't genocide of bodies. It was genocide of identity. And it worked. Generations grew up ashamed of their heritage, terrified to speak their mother tongue, unsure how to relate to parents or grandparents, unable to feel at home anywhere. And even today, descendants of those systems report identity confusion, cultural grief, and feelings of spiritual homelessness. Because when the cultural mirror is smashed, you stop recognizing your own face. This isn't just history. In modern workplaces, people from immigrant backgrounds often feel pressure to flatten their identity. You shorten your name. You stop bringing home-cooked meals. You don't correct people when they mispronounce your language, because survival begins to look like silence, and silence becomes erasure. In authoritarian states, this becomes systemic. The Uyghur population in China has been subjected to mass re-education programs where children are separated from parents and taught that Mandarin, not Uyghur, is their true language. Religious texts are banned. Mosques are bulldozed. Songs, dress, prayers, erased. The goal is not to kill the body. It's to make sure that even if the body survives, the culture does not. That's psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. And the scars aren't just external. Studies show that people who experience forced cultural assimilation often suffer from fragmented identity, difficulty forming relationships, chronic shame, disorientation about who they are supposed to be. Because when you've been told your people are inferior, or laughable, or irrelevant, you start to wonder what part of you they were trying to erase. And even if you try to reclaim your roots later in life, you might find there's nothing left to return to. The language is forgotten. The elders are gone. The songs don't sound familiar. You're left with a hole, and it's worse than absence. It's an absence you were taught to be grateful for. We saved you. We gave you opportunities. You should be thankful we brought you into the modern world. And maybe you are thankful, but somewhere deep down, you feel the grief of a version of you that never got to exist. That's the point. Erasing cultural identity isn't about hatred, it's about control. Because people with strong cultural roots resist being absorbed, they carry memories bigger than the system. They answer to ancestors, not bureaucrats. They fight for things that don't make sense to outsiders. So to make them governable, you strip their stories, you flatten the festivals, ban the clothing, standardize the language, rename the children, and then you call it integration. But what it really is psychological dismemberment. And if that sounds dramatic, consider this. What would happen if your entire cultural framework were suddenly deemed invalid? If every part of what made your family, your rituals, your childhood feel sacred, were suddenly illegal, or ridiculous, or invisible, would you still feel like you, or would something inside you collapse? That's the collapse they count on. And what comes next, once culture is broken? The body becomes the last battlefield. Because when your gender expression defies expectations and they can't change your mind, they come for your brain. Literally. Forced gender conformity via psychological torture. You're a child. You like things you're not supposed to. Your voice is too soft or too deep. Your clothes don't match the box they checked when you were born. You say something honest about who you are, and the room goes quiet. At first, they correct you gently. That's not how boys talk. Don't sit like that, young lady. You'll understand when you're older. But as you grow, the corrections harden into something colder. Isolation, mockery, conversion therapy, and eventually, if they have the power, treatment. Let's talk about the dark history of gender-based psychological torture. In mid-20th century Western psychology, especially in the US and UK, gender nonconformity was seen as a mental disorder. Children who didn't conform to expected roles were referred to clinics. What followed wasn't care. It was correction. Boys who played with dolls were made to watch videos of real boys doing manly things. Girls who liked tools were given dolls and told to smile. Sometimes they were strapped to chairs and shown photos, their heart rate, facial expressions, and even erections tracked in real time to measure progress. And if the child didn't respond correctly, they were punished. Emotionally, verbally, medically. In one case study from the 1970s, a boy was punished every time he said he liked anything feminine. Eventually, he stopped speaking much at all. The program declared him cured. He died by suicide in his 30s. This was normal. This was sanctioned. This was science. And it didn't end in the past. Today, around the world, LGBTQ+ individuals are still subjected to psychological conversion programs. These are often disguised as spiritual counseling, therapeutic interventions, or family healing. The methods: repeated verbal degradation, coerced roleplay, shaming rituals, forced isolation from peers, endless prayer, or cleansing routines. And worst of all, telling them they are not real. You're confused. This is a phase. The real you is waiting once we get rid of this sickness. The person is taught to distrust their own perception. They're told their instincts are lies. Their comfort is rebellion. Their body is an enemy. This is psychological torture. It doesn't leave bruises, but it erodes identity from the inside out. Even more disturbingly, some countries have used involuntary psychosurgery, brain operations, on individuals accused of deviant sexual identity, claiming to cure them of abnormal behavior. These cases are rare, but they exist. One man in Eastern Europe was diagnosed as mentally unstable due to his gender expression. He was institutionalized, subjected to hormone manipulation without consent, and ultimately lobotomized to stop his confused thoughts. He survived, physically, but those who knew him said he never returned. Let's step back. Why does forced gender conformity work as a mind control tactic? Because gender is not a surface trait. It's foundational. It connects body to story. When someone controls how you dress, move, speak, and love, they're not just modifying behavior, they're rewriting identity through trauma. Over time, many victims develop depersonalization, chronic shame, body dysmorphia, PTSD, suicidality, internalized hatred of their own reflection. And in some cases, they comply. They go quiet. They dress appropriately. They smile on command, and to outsiders, they look better. But inside, the self has been hollowed out, replaced by a performance driven by fear. This is what control wants. Not just obedience, but internalized obedience. A person who punishes themselves every time they feel joy. A mind that automatically says wrong before it says real. And here's the worst part. Some victims of this psychological conditioning become enforcers. They teach the next generation to stay inside the lines. They become the voice of their own oppressor. Not because they're evil, but because it's the only way they learned how to survive. And so the cycle continues. This isn't about bathrooms. This isn't about fashion. This is about whether you are allowed to exist as yourself without punishment. And when the answer is no, what you get isn't conformity. What you get is a walking erasure. The implantation of false confessions. Let's say someone asks you a simple question. Where were you last night? You answer honestly. But they tell you you're wrong. You try again. They shake their head. They say they have proof. They show you a grainy photo, a vague timestamp, a voice recording that kind of sounds like you if you squint. They say, you must have forgotten. Stress does that. People saw you. It's okay, just admit it. It'll be easier if you cooperate. And after hours, days, weeks of this, you start to believe them. Welcome to memory surrender, The core mechanism behind false confessions. It doesn't take torture, just time, fatigue, and the careful collapse of certainty. Let's take one of the most studied examples. In 1989, a 16-year-old boy named Martin Tankleff woke up to find his parents murdered. The police brought him in. He insisted he didn't do it. But during hours of questioning, an officer lied to him, said his father had briefly regained consciousness in the hospital, and named him as the killer. Martin broke down. He started to doubt his own memory. He said, "Maybe I blacked out. Maybe I did it and don't remember." That was enough. He was convicted, served 17 years. Only later did DNA evidence prove his innocence. This is not rare. According to the Innocence Project, over 25% of overturned wrongful convictions involve false confessions. Let that sink in. 1 in 4. But why would anyone admit to something they didn't do? The answer is psychological destabilization. When someone is isolated, sleep-deprived, emotionally pressured, and confronted with fabricated evidence, the mind does something desperate. It tries to make a coherent story. Because the brain cannot tolerate uncertainty forever. And if the only way out is to believe the lie, it will. This has been weaponized by intelligence agencies, cult leaders, military interrogators, even therapists. In one case from the 1990s, a woman undergoing recovered memory therapy began to recall under pressure that she had participated in satanic rituals and child sacrifice. None of it was true. But the therapist's authority, combined with vivid imagery and suggestion, had produced synthetic memory indistinguishable from real trauma in her own mind. She ended up institutionalized. What makes this tactic so dangerous is that it bypasses logic. It's not about evidence, it's about belief under duress. Think of it like this. Your memory is not a recording. It's a reconstruction made each time you recall it. And when someone controls the reconstruction conditions, what lighting is used, what emotions are triggered, what facts are offered, they can plant new bricks in your memory's foundation. Sometimes, without even knowing it, you become the architect of your own false confession. This is why trained interrogators use long sessions without breaks, subtle shifts in language, hypothetical roleplay. Yenja. What if you had done it? False evidence. Emotional manipulation. Think about your family, and it works. Because people want relief more than they want truth. After enough pressure, even the most defiant mind begins to crave conclusion, any conclusion, just to stop the spiral. And that's the horror. The moment you confess, the pain stops. You're taken back to your cell. The questions end. You feel a brief sense of calm. And even though something inside you knows it was a lie, you begin to live with it. You begin to accept it. You begin to merge with the story they gave you. That's not just coercion. That's psychological rewriting, a hijacking of memory, identity, and moral compass. In some cases, victims of this process will continue to believe the false confession even after they're proven innocent, because the idea of "I was broken" is too unbearable. So the mind clings to the lie. Because it feels earned. That's the final erasure. When the confession becomes not just something you said, but something you believe. And once belief is taken, the next tactic can reverse the roles entirely. Not only will you believe you did it, you might start to think you deserved it. Role reversal torture, victim as perpetrator. Let's start with something deceptively simple. A child is abused by a parent. But when they speak up, they're told, "You provoked me. You were being difficult. This is your fault." And if it happens often enough, they stop identifying as a victim. They start identifying as the cause. This is role reversal, the psychological tactic of flipping the script so completely that the injured party becomes the accused. Now take that and crank it into a weapon. In interrogations, in cults, in prisons, and even in schools and families, the goal is to make the person believe they were the abuser, even when they weren't. It starts small. You're told your reaction to trauma hurt others. You're accused of drama, selfishness, or manipulation for expressing pain. Then it escalates. You're shown twisted versions of your actions. You're told someone cried because of something you said. You're told your presence made others feel unsafe. You're accused of having aggression you didn't know was in you. Eventually, you begin to apologize for things you didn't do. Then you begin to believe you did them. And finally, you internalize that you were the monster all along. This is how abuse becomes self-sustaining. Let's look at a real example. In totalitarian regimes, like Mao's China during the Cultural Revolution, children were trained to report their own parents for thought crimes. A 16-year-old boy named Yu was celebrated after turning in his mother for allegedly criticizing the party. She was arrested and beaten. The boy was praised as a hero. He was told he'd saved the revolution. Years later, he learned the accusation was planted, that his mother never said anything, that the interrogation was based on false testimony. But by then, the damage was done. His role had already shifted. He wasn't the grieving son of a victim. He was the instrument of her destruction. He lived with it for the rest of his life. This is not rare. In many authoritarian systems, people are forced under psychological or physical pressure to write self-criticisms. They must confess not only to crimes they didn't commit, but to being morally broken. I have failed the collective. My selfishness hurt others. I must change myself. It becomes a performance of guilt, then a ritual, then a belief. Even victims of war crimes, rape survivors, prisoners of war, cult escapes, often report a haunting inversion. They feel responsible. They feel complicit. They feel shame. And predators know this, because when you flip the victim into the villain, two things happen. They stop fighting back. They protect the abuser. This is seen in domestic abuse cases all over the world. A woman is beaten, but then she's told she made him angry. She apologizes. She tries to be better. Eventually, she says things like, "I'm hard to live with. I push people away. I deserved it." That's not weakness. That's psychological reprogramming. The mind has rewritten the moral structure of the story. And here's the final, most disturbing twist. Sometimes, survivors of role reversal torture begin to police others. They become harsh, judgmental, paranoid of ever seeming too emotional or too weak, because they've internalized the idea that their suffering was actually dangerous to others. So they suppress it, deny it, punish anyone else who expresses it. This isn't healing. It's identity collapse, rebranded as moral growth, and it works best when the praise starts. You're so mature now. You've taken responsibility. You've owned your part, even though their only part was being destroyed. That's the weapon. Not to kill the body, not even to destroy the mind, but to reverse the moral compass so the victim points inward forever. And when that process is reinforced with rewards, validation, and praise, you get loyalty. That's what the next tactic explores. Brainwashing by praise, turning loyalty into a mirror. There's a strange thing that happens to humans. If you tell someone they're bad, they might rebel. But if you tell them they're good because they obey, they will often go to terrifying lengths to stay that way. This is praise as control, not as encouragement, not as recognition, but as strategic reinforcement of submission, internalized so deeply it feels like self-worth. Let's walk through a disturbing example. A young woman joins a high-control religious group. She's praised for modesty, praised for obedience, praised for maturity when she cuts off friends who question the group. Every time she gives up part of her old self, she's celebrated. You're chosen. You're strong. You're pure. Eventually, she starts anticipating what will earn her praise and doing it before she's asked. This is the key. The control no longer requires surveillance. She's become the mirror, reflecting back the values of the group, polishing her own image through their approval. And if she ever hesitates, that praise is withdrawn. Not punishment, absence. The silence becomes unbearable. She'll do anything to get it back. That's brainwashing by affirmation. And it works because of a deep human need, the need to feel seen as good. This tactic is used everywhere. In military indoctrination, in cult recruitment, in political regimes, even in parenting. When a child is only praised for compliance, they learn to associate love with erasure of dissent. You're such a good boy when you don't cry. You're so grown up when you don't argue. We're proud of you for staying quiet. Over time, the child stops noticing what they feel. They only track what the adult wants them to feel, and they become skilled at it. Eventually, they aren't being silenced. They're self-silencing, not out of fear, out of pride. This is what philosopher Michel Foucault described with his concept of the panopticon, the idea that power is most effective when it becomes internal. You don't need guards. You just need the prisoner to watch themselves. Praise helps make that happen. Let's take another real-world case. In the infamous Heaven's Gate cult, members were not ruled by beatings or threats. They were praised. Constantly. Praised for transcending the human ego. Praised for letting go of family, emotion, and desire. Praised for their readiness to evolve. And when it came time to die, they did it smiling, because they'd been told that death was a reward for their loyalty. This is how dangerous praise can be, because the person isn't resisting, they're volunteering. And worse, they begin to judge others who don't conform. This is the mirror effect. Once someone has internalized that they are good because they obey, anyone who disobeys becomes bad, a threat to their identity. That's how controlled individuals become enforcers. Think of it like this. A loyal follower doesn't just follow rules, they defend the rules. They become angry at those who question them. Because if those people are right, then they were wrong. And the pain of that is unbearable. So they double down. They become louder, more devout, more obedient, and they feel proud, because in their mind, they are not broken. They are righteous. That's the final twist. When obedience becomes morality, when compliance becomes virtue, and when praise becomes not just a motivator, but proof of worth, the next step is even more devastating. Because once someone has been praised into loyalty, what happens when you erase the very source of that praise? What if the self so carefully built around approval starts to collapse when that approval is withdrawn? Then you get a deeper kind of disappearance. Memory rewriting through suggestion and interrogation. Imagine waking up in a hospital room. You're injured, confused. You remember nothing. A man in a suit walks in and says, "Don't worry, we found you at the site of the explosion. You tried to save the others." You blink. Explosion. What others? He shows you a news clipping, a blurry photo that could be you. Says, "You're a hero." You want to believe him. Your body hurts. You're scared. You don't know who you are. So you grab the story. Now imagine 2 weeks later. A different man walks in. He says, "There was no explosion. You killed them. You confessed." He shows you a different photo, a different version. And now, you don't know which story is real. This isn't just a thought experiment. It's how memory rewriting works. Not through deletion, but through construction under duress. The term psychologists use is memory conformity, and it happens whenever your internal recollection bends to match external suggestion. And when you're vulnerable, frightened, isolated, exhausted, this effect intensifies dramatically. Let's take a real example. In the early 2000s, psychologist Julia Shaw ran an experiment where participants were told falsely that they had committed a crime in their teenage years. They were shown doctored evidence. They were reminded of emotional reactions. They were encouraged to visualize it happening. Within a few sessions, 70% of them started to recall the event in vivid detail, an event that never happened. Some even described specific actions, feelings, and consequences. That's not lying. That's synthetic memory. The brain accepting the story because it's easier than doubt. This tactic is exploited by interrogators, manipulators, cult leaders, and authoritarians. The process goes like this: destabilize certainty through isolation, exhaustion, or contradictory information. Offer a narrative, usually one that resolves the confusion. Encourage emotional identification. How did it feel when you did that? Reward confirmation, praise, relief, even just ending the questioning. Repeat until the subject's own internal memory starts to absorb the suggestion. It doesn't have to be violent, it just has to be persistent and emotionally charged. And the scariest part, once the memory is in place, it behaves just like a real one. It activates the same parts of the brain, it triggers real emotion, and it resists correction. This is why victims of psychological abuse may remember being the aggressor. It's why cult survivors often mourn the loss of fake experiences. It's why people confess to crimes they didn't commit and still believe they're guilty, even years later. And once this rewriting process begins, it's not just memories that change, it's identity. Because your sense of self is a narrative built on remembered events. Alter the events, and you've altered who you are. This is why torture regimes don't always care about the truth. They care about getting you to believe a new version of the past. Because if they can control what you remember, they control what you are. But memory doesn't have to be rewritten from the outside. Sometimes it breaks down all on its own, especially when sleep is taken away. And when sleep disappears, memory starts to decay in real time. Let's keep going. Sleep deprivation and the collapse of recall. Sleep deprivation is not just about being tired. It is a neurological assault, and it's one of the oldest, most effective ways to destroy a mind without touching the body. When people think of torture, they picture violence. But in Guantanamo Bay, it was often chairs and lamps. Lights left on 24/7. Guards waking prisoners every 90 minutes. Loud music blasted all night. No beatings. Just a systematic denial of rest. And what happens next is terrifying. At first, confusion. Then, short-term memory loss. Then, identity fragmentation. Within 24 hours without sleep, your brain loses grip on timelines. Within 72, it starts hallucinating. After 5 days, you may forget who you are, not poetically, but neurologically. Let's break down why. Memory isn't a filing cabinet. It's a biological process. When you experience something during the day, your brain doesn't immediately save it. Instead, it waits. And during deep sleep, especially during slow wave and REM sleep, those memories are replayed, reprocessed, and encoded into long-term storage. If you don't sleep, they never make it into memory at all. This is why all-night cram sessions don't work. It's why trauma survivors often lose track of what happened, because the events were never filed. They just floated and then vanished. Sleep also cleans out toxins from the brain. Literally, when you're awake, neural byproducts build up. Sleep acts like a drain, flushing them out. No sleep. Those toxins accumulate. You start forgetting things, then misremembering things, then doubting yourself entirely. This is what intelligence agencies exploit. In MKUltra, the CIA's infamous mind control project, sleep deprivation was combined with drugs, sensory overload, and suggestion. The goal, not just to make subjects compliant, but to make them forget what happened. Victims couldn't recall their own testimony, couldn't remember what they said, or even who they were before. Because if you strip away sleep, you strip away coherence. One woman who survived prolonged sleep deprivation during religious indoctrination described it like this: "I started to feel like my memories belonged to someone else. I could hear my own voice saying things I didn't agree with, but I couldn't remember why I ever thought differently." It's not that she was brainwashed. It's that her old beliefs were erased by neurological neglect. Sleep deprivation also increases emotional volatility, paranoia, anger, despair, which makes people more suggestible. That's the magic of it, and the horror. When you deny someone sleep, you prevent memory formation, destabilize emotional regulation, increase dependency on external cues, strip away the boundary between truth and suggestion, and all without laying a hand on them. You don't need to tell someone what to believe. You just keep them awake until they forget what they believed. But even if they manage to hold on to scraps of memory, you can still bury the rest, chemically, That's where we go next. Drugs that erase events. Chemical amnesia. Let's start with a haunting story. In 1977, during a Senate hearing on human experimentation, it was revealed that the CIA had secretly tested a drug called scopolamine. The goal was not sedation, not pain, but amnesia. Victims would be conscious. They'd speak, answer questions, even move around, and the next day, they'd remember nothing. This is what chemical amnesia does. It creates a gap in the timeline, not unlike a scratch in film. The scene just jumps. No fade, no warning, no explanation. Scopolamine isn't the only one. You've probably heard of benzodiazepines like midazolam or diazepam. In medical use, they're often given before surgery to calm patients and erase the memory of invasive procedures. But what happens when that mechanism is weaponized? Midazolam has been used in interrogations, sometimes under euphemisms like sedation-assisted interviews. In some cases, suspects remember being interviewed, but forget what they said. And that's the power of these drugs. They don't just fog memory, they prevent encoding. Meaning, the brain never stores the experience at all. Think about that. You could confess to a crime, reveal your darkest secrets, or betray someone you love, and have no recollection that it ever happened. Chemical amnesia is also central to something far more common and more disturbing: date rape. Drugs like rohypnol, GHB, and ketamine are used not just to sedate, but to erase. Victims wake up with pain, trauma, and no memory, making justice nearly impossible. Because if the mind has no evidence, the world assumes nothing happened. Let's be clear. This is not accidental side effect. It's by design. These substances alter the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for transferring short-term memory into long-term storage. Interrupt that, and what happens simply never gets archived. But it gets worse. Some of these drugs don't just erase events, they erase emotions attached to those events. So even if fragments remain, you don't feel them the same way. A victim might say, "I remember something happened, but it doesn't feel real, like it happened to someone else." That's not confusion. That's neurological dislocation. And once that disconnect is in place, it becomes easier for others to rewrite the story. Because memory isn't just what happened, it's how it felt. If you erase the feeling, you loosen the story. And if you loosen the story, you can reshape the identity. This is why chemical amnesia is more than just forgetting. It's identity erasure. One former cult member described being given supplements that turned out to be benzodiazepines. "I lost whole nights, conversations, fights. And when I tried to piece it together, everyone else said I was just being paranoid." That's the final horror of drug-based amnesia. You lose trust in your own mind. And once that happens, you'll accept someone else's version of reality. But even without drugs, there's another way to inject new memories. Just keep telling the lie with authority. Creating false memories with authority and repetition. Let's begin with something chilling. In 1995, a young woman named Mary came to believe her father had sexually abused her as a child. There was just one problem: it never happened. She was in therapy for anxiety. Her therapist used a technique called guided memory recovery. She was told that many symptoms like low self-esteem or trouble sleeping were signs of repressed trauma, and that if she couldn't remember it, that was proof it had been blocked. Over time, Mary began to have vivid flashbacks. She confronted her father. He denied everything. The family collapsed. Later, an investigation found no evidence, no witnesses, no records. Just memory. Fabricated. Implanted. Believed. This isn't an isolated case. Psychologists have long known that memory is suggestible, especially when the suggestion comes from authority. In the famous Loftus experiments, people were shown footage of a car accident. Some were asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Others were asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? The ones who heard smashed reported higher speeds, more damage, and even broken glass, even though there wasn't any in the video. One word changed the memory. Now imagine that kind of influence repeated hundreds of times from someone you trust. A therapist, a parent, a religious leader, a cult elder, a state. And imagine being told, you were abused. You confessed to this. You loved it. You asked for it. At first you resist, then you start to question. Eventually you give in, because doubt is exhausting. And then one day you say, maybe I did. That moment, the crack, is enough. From there, repetition does the rest. Studies show that repeated imagination of a fictional event increases people's confidence that it actually happened. This is called the imagination inflation effect. The more vividly you picture it, the more real it becomes, even if you know it didn't happen at first. Now combine that with social pressure, like everyone around you agreeing, nodding, validating the false memory. This creates what's called source confusion, where you remember the content of the memory but forget where it came from. Did you remember it yourself, or did someone tell you? Was it a dream? A story? A hallucination? Does it matter? Your emotional brain doesn't care. It reacts anyway. It re-encodes the experience as if it were real. And now, it is. This is how cults instill loyalty. How authoritarian regimes rewrite crimes. How abusive partners convince victims they started the fight. You said it. You believed it. We all heard you. Why would we lie? It's a loop. You hear it. You question it. You surrender to it. You believe it, and it becomes a memory. This is why false confessions are so common. Why people will remember crimes they didn't commit, or betrayals that never happened, or identities that were never theirs. Not because they're lying, because someone with authority rewrote the past, one sentence at a time. But memory isn't just in your head. Sometimes it lives in objects, things you touch, hold, keep, and if those things are destroyed, the memories go with them. Destruction of personal objects as memory anchors. Let's try a simple thought experiment. Imagine you wake up tomorrow and your room is empty. Everything is gone. Not stolen, just removed, without damage. No sign of violence, no broken glass, just absence. The photos? Gone. The letters? Gone. The books? Your childhood toy, the clothes you wore at your graduation? Gone. How long would it take before you started to feel like you were the one missing? See, memory doesn't live in isolation. We remember our lives through context, and that context is often external. This is called autobiographical anchoring. Touching your grandfather's watch doesn't just remind you of him. It reactivates a whole network of memories, the sound of his voice, the way he laughed, the way he smelled. Take away the watch, and the memory begins to fade. Not immediately, but gradually, like a photo left in the sun. This is why in some cultures, erasing a person's belongings is a final form of death. In North Korea, when a political dissident is imprisoned or executed, their family's entire home may be emptied, not just of people, but of objects, photos, documents, clothing, even school records. What's left is a space where it looks like they never existed. It's called physical erasure, and it works. Survivors describe the eerie feeling of being unable to prove their loved one ever lived. Even memories begin to feel uncertain without something to trigger them. This isn't just psychological, it's neurological. Studies show that object-triggered recall activates the hippocampus more strongly than abstract reflection. In other words, seeing a wedding ring remembers better than just thinking about the wedding. So if someone wants to erase you, really erase you, they don't need to harm your brain. They just need to remove your environment. This tactic has been used in religious cults, confiscating jewelry, cutting off access to music or books from the old life, colonial assimilation, burning indigenous artifacts, banning language, renaming people. When repetition replaces reality, the false familiarity trick. Let's play a trick on your mind. Try to remember this sentence. The sun revolves around the earth. You know it's false. Obviously. But what if I said it to you again? The sun revolves around the earth. And again. The sun revolves around the earth. By the 10th time, something strange starts to happen. You don't believe it, but your brain starts to tolerate it. By the 20th time, it feels oddly familiar. And that's the crack. The moment your brain whispers, "I've heard this before," that whisper is dangerous, because the mind often trusts what it recognizes. This is called the illusory truth effect. Psychologists discovered it in the 1970s. Participants were more likely to rate repeated false statements as true simply because they had seen them before. It doesn't matter how absurd the statement is. The more you hear it, the more true it feels. Now imagine how that works in a controlled environment. A prisoner is told, "You confessed already. You agreed to this. You signed the papers." They didn't, but they've heard it so many times, so calmly, so consistently, that doubt begins to eat away at resistance. And eventually they think, "Maybe I did." This tactic is used in interrogation rooms, but it's also used by abusers, cults, and even marketers. Advertisers repeat slogans until the brand feels like part of your identity. Governments repeat phrases like "war on terror" until opposition feels unpatriotic. Social groups repeat norms until they feel like truth. It's not logic, it's exposure. Familiarity becomes comfort, and comfort becomes belief. But it goes deeper. In one experiment, people were shown unfamiliar symbols. Later, they were shown a mix of symbols, some they'd seen before, some not. They were asked, "Which ones do you trust more?" Almost everyone chose the ones they'd seen before, even though they were meaningless. This is the mere exposure effect. Now apply that to ideas. If you hear the government is watching enough times, you begin to feel like it's always been true. Not because you have evidence, but because it's been repeated into reality. And repetition works even better when it's subtle. That's why jingles are short, why slogans are simple, why propaganda posters use 5 words or fewer. Repetition is a weapon. It turns lies into background noise and background noise into truth. And here's the most disturbing part. It bypasses conscious resistance. You might disagree with the message. You might even laugh at it, but the more you hear it, the more your brain files it under known. And known means safe. And safe means real. This is how cults indoctrinate members. How abusers wear down their partners. How systems normalize injustice by saying the same thing over and over until reality feels different. So what happens when this technique is used not just to insert a new reality, but to erase the old one? What happens when your brain can no longer tell the difference between the truth you lived and the story you were told? For many, the answer is dissociation, a psychological emergency eject button. You escape by fragmenting, by severing memory from identity, by letting the mind erase itself. Dissociation as mind's self-erasure mechanism. You've heard of people spacing out, but this isn't zoning out during a boring lecture. This is more like watching your own life from behind glass. You see your hands moving. You hear your voice speaking, but it doesn't feel like you. That's dissociation. And for some people, especially those subjected to long-term psychological harm, it becomes permanent. Let's rewind. Imagine a child growing up in a house where punishment is unpredictable. Some days, spilling milk gets ignored. Other days, it gets a slap. There's no logic, just threat. The child can't run away, can't fight back. So the brain does something else. It creates a distance. It says, "This isn't happening to me. I'm watching this happen to someone else." This is called depersonalization. The person becomes detached from their own body, emotions, and identity. But dissociation doesn't always start in childhood. It can be induced later through trauma, isolation, gaslighting, or overload. And here's the terrifying part. Once it starts, it can spread. You begin by numbing out during arguments, then during work, then during joy. Eventually, the entire emotional spectrum flattens. The world becomes unreal. Your memories feel like they belong to someone else. Your body becomes something you operate, not inhabit. This is called derealization. Many survivors of emotional abuse report these symptoms. So do soldiers returning from war. So do cult escapees, torture victims, and even people recovering from intense religious indoctrination. Why? Because their minds had to split in order to stay intact. But what if that split never heals? What if the only way to survive was to stay fragmented? Some people begin to develop alternate personas, different modes of being that don't know each other. Each version holds a part of the trauma. Each version pretends the others don't exist. This is the clinical basis of dissociative identity disorder. And even in milder forms, dissociation can make a person feel like a ghost in their own life. Memories become inaccessible. Conversations feel scripted. The self becomes foggy. Here's the punchline. This is the brain trying to help. Dissociation isn't a malfunction. It's the mind's last-ditch effort to preserve something by deleting everything else. Like a computer under attack, it cuts the cord, powers down systems, and runs in safe mode. But if you never leave safe mode, you forget how to function at all. And when dissociation becomes chronic, the person becomes unreachable, not because someone erased them, but because they erased themselves. To survive. It's the cleanest kind of mind death. No marks, no bruises, just absence. And it leads us to a deeper fracture, one that doesn't just break memory or personality, but breaks time itself. Chronophobia, losing the thread of time. Let's start small. Have you ever woken up from a nap, not sure what day it is? You check your phone. It says Tuesday, but your body still feels like Sunday. It's disorienting, unpleasant, but it fades. Now imagine that feeling doesn't fade. Imagine it deepens. You wake up, and the sequence is gone. You don't know if it's morning or night. You don't know how long you've been in this room. You don't remember what happened yesterday. You don't know what's supposed to happen next. This is chronophobia, the fear and disintegration of time. It's most often observed in prisoners, especially those in solitary confinement. They report hallucinating clocks, imagining days passing that never happened, feeling like years have passed, even if it's only been weeks. Because time isn't just measured by watches, it's measured by events, by routine, by narrative. Take away routine, and time loses its markers. Take away light, sound, people, and time becomes meaningless. There's a reason solitary confinement is considered a form of psychological torture. It doesn't just isolate the body. It shatters temporal continuity. In one famous experiment, psychologist Donald Hebb paid student volunteers to lie in a dark room with no sound and no clocks. After just 2 days, they reported losing track of time completely. Some thought hours had passed. Others thought days. Some began to hallucinate, and almost all began to forget who they were. Because selfhood isn't just memory. It's memory in order. Imagine cutting a film reel into pieces, tossing them on the floor, and watching random clips on repeat. That's what happens when time collapses. You know things happened, you just don't know when, or why, or what led to what. This is common in trauma survivors. Their memories are fragmented, out of sequence, unanchored, which makes them feel unreal. They'll say things like, "I know it happened, but it feels like it happened to someone else. I can't remember what happened before or after. I feel stuck in that moment, like I never left." Time is identity glue. Lose it, and the story breaks apart. In dementia, this process becomes visible. Patients forget not just people, but when those people existed, they think their adult children are still toddlers. They think they're still married to someone long dead. And the terror they feel, it's not just memory loss, it's temporal loss. They know something's wrong. They just can't locate it in time. Even in high-stress environments, like war, soldiers describe time dilation, time holes, and frozen moments. Your brain triages what to keep and what to drop. And when time can't be tracked, you can't be tracked. Chronophobia isn't fear of the future. It's fear of losing when you are. And once your mind loses the thread of time, it starts misfiling everything else: names, faces, events, feelings, like stuffing your life into a broken filing cabinet where nothing lands in the right place. And that's exactly where we go next. Filing cabinet brain. When trauma misfiles memory, think of your memory like a filing cabinet. When something happens to you, a conversation, a car ride, a birthday, your brain writes it down on a piece of paper. It tags it with a date, a feeling, maybe a smell, or a sound. Then it files it neatly in a drawer. Tuesday, March 5th. Joy. That's a normal memory. But trauma doesn't get filed like that. Trauma is a crumpled piece of paper shoved into the wrong drawer. No label, no context, no timestamp. So later, when something reminds you of it, a face, a tone, a hallway, the drawer flies open. You read the paper, and it feels like it's happening now. This is the difference between remembering a fire and feeling the heat on your skin in the middle of a grocery store. It's not just PTSD. Many survivors of emotional abuse, childhood neglect, or repeated gaslighting experience this exact thing. Because the brain in trauma prioritizes survival over accuracy. During extreme stress, your amygdala, the fear center, hijacks your attention. It screams, "Record the danger, not the details." So your brain grabs a handful of emotion and tosses it in a drawer. But later, when you try to reconstruct the story, the details don't line up. You might say, "I remember feeling terrified, but I don't know why. I remember crying, but I can't picture the room. I remember what happened, but I don't believe it happened to me." Your own mind becomes a hostile witness. In some cases, memories resurface in the wrong context. A survivor of childhood abuse might suddenly feel crushing guilt when hugging their own child, not because they've done anything wrong, but because the emotion was misfiled. This is why trauma doesn't just haunt you, it scrambles you. It mixes up cause and effect, emotion and event. You might have a panic attack when someone knocks on the door, even though the danger you lived through had nothing to do with doors. That's because the memory didn't get stored with a door. It got stored with fear. And fear is a universal key. It opens the wrong drawers. Now think about what that does to identity. How do you build a coherent sense of self? If your life story is out of order, if pieces are missing, if some pieces belong to someone else, if the most painful parts of your life feel like they never really happened but hurt anyway, this is how people start to doubt their own minds. And when that doubt deepens, one last tactic emerges, sometimes from within, sometimes from outside. A lie, a very specific lie. A lie repeated, reinforced, institutionalized, and echoed back by everyone around you, until it becomes the only thing that makes emotional sense, even if it's false. The lie that becomes the only truth. Let's start with a survivor. A woman grows up in a family that never talks about what her uncle did. She remembers a few things: moments in the hallway, the way he looked at her, the smell of beer on his breath. But every time she brought it up as a child, she was told, "Don't make things up. He's your uncle. He loves you. You're too sensitive." Eventually, she stopped asking, stopped remembering, stopped trusting herself. Years later, she feels intense anxiety around family events. She hates being touched. But when asked why, she shrugs. "I don't know." That's the lie, doing its work. Because if everyone you trust says it didn't happen, if your own brain is trained to erase and rewrite, then the only story that feels safe is the one they gave you. This happens more than you think. Not just in families, in cults, in schools, in therapy, in prisons, in governments. The goal isn't just to lie to you once, it's to make the lie feel like the only safe explanation. And it starts early. Maybe your parents told you you were bad because you cried too much. Maybe your teacher said you were lazy instead of noticing you were scared. Maybe your church told you that your thoughts were sinful and only submission would save you. At first you resist. You feel that something's off. But the mind has a survival instinct, and it's willing to amputate reality to stay attached to the group. So slowly, the lie becomes the rule. I'm the problem. I imagined it. They're right. I must be wrong. And here's where it gets darker. Once the lie settles in, your own brain starts protecting it. You'll reinterpret old memories to match it. You'll ignore evidence that contradicts it. You'll lash out at people who question it, because questioning it would mean revisiting what really happened. And that's unbearable. This mechanism is common in survivors of systemic abuse, especially institutional cover-ups. Victims are not just silenced by others, they learn to silence themselves. The lie is taught with reward, praise, belonging, peace. The truth is punished with pain, shame, isolation, chaos. So the person begins to want the lie, to need it, to protect it, even when something inside them knows it doesn't quite fit. This is what philosopher Michel Foucault warned about. Power doesn't just control bodies, it manufactures truth itself. And when a lie becomes embedded in your sense of identity, it becomes harder to root out than any memory, belief, or fear. Because to destroy the lie, you'd have to rebuild the story of who you are. And for many people, that's more terrifying than living a fiction. But for some, even fiction can't hold them together anymore. Not when the self has eroded to the point that even being someone becomes exhausting. And that's when we move to the final stage. Not deleting memory or truth or identity, but deleting selfhood itself.